A quiet era hiding loud secrets. The Victorian world rarely raised its voice. Its streets hummed with quiet order, its parlors glowed with soft lamplight, and its people walked with the gentle restraint of those who believed silence was a form of dignity. From the outside, it was a calm age, an era of ironed gowns, tidy morals, and minds trained to speak softly. But history often hides its loudest truths behind its quietest moments, and Victorian England was no different. Beneath its polished exterior, beneath the lace curtains and gaslit streets, lingered a secret that shaped the lives of women more profoundly than any public law, sermon, or social expectation. The secret did not shout. It whispered, and it whispered through the smallest of objects, tiny glass bottles that glinted innocently in the corner of almost every home. In the quiet town of Highborough, surrounded by rolling fields and the distant smoke of coal trains, Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb lived the kind of life that Victorian novels often admired. At 33, she was neither old nor young, neither remarkable nor forgettable. Her life followed a predictable rhythm: morning tea, late morning correspondence, an afternoon stroll, and evenings spent by the fireplace while her husband, Charles, read the newspaper. Their marriage was polite, not passionate, secure, not intimate. Like many others in her position, Eleanor accepted this as her natural fate. But acceptance did not always mean contentment. In the early winter of 1886, Eleanor began waking with a strange heaviness behind her eyes, not a pain exactly, but a dull weight, as if a fog drifted through her thoughts before the morning light could push it away. She felt restless but tired, alert but unfocused. Some days she struggled to recall the details of conversations she had the day before. Other days she simply felt nothing at all, a kind of numbness she dared not confess aloud. Charles noticed only the smallest things: a sigh too long, a pause too deep, a moment when her smile seemed held together by effort rather than ease. Like any dutiful Victorian husband, he did not ask why. Instead, he suggested the practical solution that society had taught him. "You must be overwrought, Eleanor. It's quite common for women of refined sensibilities. Perhaps a tonic would help." A tonic. That was the word. The same word mothers whispered to daughters, doctors prescribed with confidence, and pharmacists recommended with pride. A simple remedy for nerves, exhaustion, sleeplessness, worry, the entire spectrum of feminine distress. Eleanor had heard of it many times, though she had never needed it before. At least, she didn't think she had. But the mind can become lonely quietly, and loneliness in Victorian women often went unnoticed even by themselves. The next morning, Charles visited the town apothecary and returned with a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied neatly with twine. He set it on Eleanor's writing desk before heading out for the day. "For your comfort," he said, almost proudly. "Just a few drops in water. The apothecary says it works wonders." Eleanor stared at the parcel long after the door closed behind him. The paper was thin and slightly fragrant, almost warm from the pharmacist's hands. When she finally unwrapped it, the bottle inside caught the morning light in a soft glimmer. It was lovely, truly lovely. Clear, curved glass with a pearlescent sheen, a cork stopper cut perfectly to size, and a delicate label written in looping script. The laudanum. For relief, rest, and tranquility. She had heard the word before, of course. Everyone had. Laudanum was a familiar presence in Victorian society, as normal as aspirin today. Even the most respectable households kept it near the bedside, tucked discreetly behind tea tins or sewing baskets. Newspapers praised it, doctors trusted it, women relied on it. But Eleanor had never taken a single drop. She hesitated, not out of fear, but out of pride. Admitting she needed anything at all felt like a small defeat. Victorian women were expected to be gentle but strong, fragile yet composed, emotional yet controlled. Somewhere in that tangled web of contradictions, Eleanor had learned to hide her discomfort rather than acknowledge it. Yet something in her chest, perhaps the fog that had followed her through the past weeks, urged her to try the tonic. Just once. Just to see. She poured a small glass of water. Her hand trembled slightly, though she blamed the cold morning. She removed the cork. The scent was sweet, like spiced syrup laced with something darker. 1 drop. 2. 3. The water turned faintly amber. She stirred it and drank slowly. The effect did not hit like a rush. It unfurled gently, like the loosening of a corset after hours of tightness. Her breath deepened. The weight behind her eyes lifted. The quiet world around her, the clock ticking, the curtains swaying, the creak of the floorboards settling, felt suddenly softened, like fabric brushed smooth. A warmth spread through her limbs, not joyous, not euphoric, but pleasantly muted. Calm, steady, soft. It felt good. Better than she expected. By afternoon, she found herself humming during her walk, something she had not done in months. Words came more easily in conversation. The air felt lighter. Even her husband noticed. "You look quite refreshed," Charles said at dinner, nodding approvingly. "I suppose I am," she replied, and she meant it. That night, Eleanor slept deeply for the first time since autumn's end. The next morning, she awoke clear-headed, bright, almost cheerful, unusual enough that her housemaid, Clara, commented on it. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but you seem much improved today." Eleanor smiled. "Perhaps I simply needed rest." But the truth touched her thoughts quietly. She remembered the tonic. The bottle glimmered in the morning light, sitting innocently beside her teacup. She didn't take that day. She didn't need to. Or so she told herself. And yet, that afternoon, as she sat alone in the parlor writing a letter to her cousin in Bath, she felt the familiar fog creeping back, softer first, then thicker, a gentle pressure behind her temples that clouded her senses. She paused mid-sentence, stared out the window at the bleak gray sky, and felt something within her tighten undesirably. Not pain, just discomfort. An unsettled mind yearning for ease. Her eyes drifted to the bottle. She took it. 1 drop less this time, maybe 2. The effect returned, warm and gentle, like sinking into a familiar chair. For the rest of the day, her mood softened once more. Thus began a quiet pattern. A drop on mornings when she felt tired, a drop before writing letters, a drop before going out, a drop on days when the house felt too still. She did not feel dependent. Dependent was a strong word. She simply enjoyed how it made her feel, how it smoothed the edges of her thoughts and softened the weight of expectations that pressed invisibly on Victorian women like hers. After all, it was medicine. Medicine was meant to help, and everyone used it. There was nothing unusual about that. Weeks passed, and winter deepened. Snow dusted the rooftops of Highborough. Lamps glowed earlier in the afternoons. Conversations grew shorter, days quieter. And slowly, so slowly, Eleanor barely noticed, the tonic became a part of her routine, a quiet companion in moments of fatigue, anxiety, or simply idle hours. It was only in rare flashes, moments too brief to hold, that she sensed something shifting within her. A sharper laugh, a quicker temper, a sudden burst of restlessness. But these moments flickered and vanished before she could examine them. One evening, during a small dinner gathering, she found herself speaking rapidly, too rapidly, jumping from one topic to the next with a bubbling energy that surprised her husband and delighted their guests. She did not realize she had taken a slightly larger dose earlier that day. "Oh, Eleanor," she remarked with a laugh, "I've never seen you so animated." Eleanor blinked, unable to recall exactly what she had been saying. Her cheeks felt warm, her pulse quickened without reason. But the moment passed. She smiled politely. The evening continued. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she could not fall asleep. Her heart felt might, her mind restless, her hands tingling faintly beneath the blankets. She arose, pacing quietly so as not to wake Charles. Only after drinking warm milk did she finally settle. She did not connect the feeling to the tonic. Why would she? The tonic was safe.
The medicine cabinet no one questioned. The medicine cabinet in the Whitcomb household was not unusual. It was a small wooden cupboard with a brass latch, tucked neatly against the wall beside the pantry. Visitors rarely noticed it, and the family rarely spoke of it. It was the kind of cabinet every respectable Victorian home possessed, a quiet, unquestioned presence, as ordinary as the hearth or the teapot. Inside it, arranged with careful precision, sat a collection of bottles and tins that reflected the habits of the era. Peppermint water for indigestion, castor oil for purifying the system, powdered chalk for stomach discomfort, and a soothing syrup labeled in elegant black lettering. Each item had its place. Each item had its purpose. And each item was trusted, sometimes far more than it should have been. Households did not debate the contents of their medicine cabinets. They accepted them. They relied on them. They believed in them with the same unquestioning faith that they placed in churches, doctors, and the comforting rigidity of social order. To question medicine in Victorian England was almost unthinkable. What else could one trust, if not the very substances created to ease the burdens of living? When Eleanor Whitcomb opened her cabinet that winter morning, she did so with a sense of quiet ritual. She had grown familiar with the soft creak of the door, the smell of dried herbs lingering inside, and the polished smoothness of the glass bottles. But now there was something new in that small wooden space, something that changed the room's atmosphere even before she touched it. The bottle of laudanum stood in the middle shelf, gleaming like a jewel among ordinary stones. It seemed brighter than before, although Eleanor knew that was simply a trick of the morning sun. Still, she found her eyes drawn to it. The rest of the cabinet seemed almost dull beside it, as though the other medicines had lost their importance. She brushed her fingertips along the curved surface of the bottle and felt a peculiar sense of reassurance, almost fondness. It was strange to attach emotion to an object, yet she could not deny the feeling. The tonic had eased her discomfort, quieted her mind, and softened the sharp edges of her thoughts in ways nothing else had ever done. It had become her silent ally. Still, she hesitated before taking it that morning. She told herself doing so would make her weak. She told herself she should rely on her own strength. And yet, with a soft sigh, she unstoppered the bottle and added a small measure to her tea. Just a whisper of amber color, nothing more. It dissolved instantly, disappearing as though it had never been there. But Eleanor knew. Her body knew. Her emotions knew. She sipped the tea slowly, savoring its warmth, as the subtle influence of the tonic began its gentle work. Days passed, then weeks. The medicine cabinet became a place she visited more often, though never to retrieve anything except the same bottle. A quiet relationship formed between her and the glass container. She never spoke of it to Clara or Charles. She hardly spoke of it to herself. But the truth sat in her mind like a secret, comforting, constant, easy to reach for whenever life felt heavy. And life felt heavy more often than she wanted to admit. Highborough was a peaceful town, but its peace could be suffocating. The winter air carried the scent of coal smoke and damp stone. Houses lined the narrow streets like rows of quiet watchers. People moved in predictable patterns, familiar faces traveling familiar paths. The routines that once soothed Eleanor now seemed to press upon her, creating a dull ache of monotony she struggled to ignore. Every woman she met seemed to carry the same invisible burdens, unspoken worries, restless minds, small disappointments swallowed quietly because society afforded them no place to speak them aloud. Marianne Fletcher, who lived 2 streets over, often clutched a lace handkerchief during conversations, as though holding herself together. Mrs. Harrowley, despite her cheerful greetings, wore tiredness beneath her eyes that powder could not disguise. And little Lydia Croft, newly married, smiled too brightly, as if practiced joy might hide her anxieties. Eleanor wondered if they, too, had a bottle in their cabinets. She wondered if laudanum had given them their composure. She wondered how many women in town were floating, quietly beneath its influence, drifting through their daily lives with softened minds and smoothed emotions. The thought should have troubled her. Instead, it comforted her. If others used the tonic, then she was not unusual, not flawed, not weak. She was simply normal. And normalcy had always been the safest thing for a Victorian woman to be. On a quiet Thursday morning, Eleanor found herself in the parlor, seated by the window with embroidery resting gently across her lap. Snow flurries drifted outside like pale feathers, layering the garden with soft white. The house was warm, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Everything looked peaceful. Yet something in her chest felt uneasy. She could not name the emotion. Was it boredom? Restlessness? A strange feeling of inner trembling that made her hands uneasy? She paused, needle in the air, and pressed her palm against her ribcage. Why did she feel like a bird fluttering inside a cage? She set the embroidery aside and stood slowly. Her steps were quiet. As she crossed the hallway, the faint tapping of her heels accompanied by the gentle sway of her skirts. At the medicine cabinet, the air felt colder. She opened the door and stared at the bottle. It stared back. A part of her tried to resist. She told herself she did not need it. She told herself she should demonstrate restraint. She told herself she had already taken enough in the past week. But her breathing quickened slightly. Her fingers trembled in anticipation. Her thoughts grew hazy, unfocused, as though urging her towards release. When she reached for the bottle, her hand no longer hesitated. She poured more than usual. Just a little more. She didn't notice the difference in amount, but her body did. Later that afternoon, Clara entered the drawing room with a fresh pot of tea and nearly jumped when she saw Eleanor pacing in slow, restless circles. "Ma'am, are you quite well?" Clara asked softly. Eleanor paused abruptly and turned toward the young maid, her expression bright, too bright. Her eyes sparkled with an intensity she had never seen before. "Oh, Clara, yes, I feel marvelous. The air feels crisp, doesn't it? And the snow, look at it. Isn't it lovely? I think we should air out the house. It feels stuffy, doesn't it? Charles always says the winter air is invigorating, don't you think so?" Clara blinked. Eleanor's tone was not alarming, just unusual. "I'll fetch the flowers, ma'am," Clara said gently, keeping her voice steady. When the maid left the room, Eleanor suddenly stopped pacing. Her energy dimmed like a candle losing its flame. A wave of exhaustion pressed down on her. She sat abruptly, clasping her hands together as her heart raced. What was happening to her? She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, breathing slowly until her pulse settled. A soft, sinking feeling washed through her mind, familiar, almost comforting. The tonic was wearing off. Its absence tugged at her nerves like a child pulling at a mother's sleeve. She closed her eyes and let the sensation pass. But the moment it did, a new realization took shape, faint but clear. She would need another dose before evening. Not to feel pleasure, not to feel joy, but to feel normal. That night, she slept poorly again, tossing, turning, slipping in and out of shallow dreams that left a sour taste of unease in her thoughts. She awoke before dawn with a dull ache behind her eyes and a sensation.
When women became the constant patients, the morning fog clung to the narrow lanes of Windermere like a shy guest reluctant to depart, and the pale winter sun cast a silvery wash across the small brick homes lined neatly beside one another. Inside these homes, modest, warm, always scented faintly of soap and coal, women moved about in soft patterns, their days unfolding in rhythms so predictable they felt almost rehearsed. Yet beneath the gentle routines, something else pulsed, something quieter, harder to name, something that made so many of them patients long before they ever felt like people. It was a strange truth of the age. Women were ill because society insisted they must be. Sometimes the illness was nerves. Sometimes it was weakness of mind. Sometimes it was female hysteria, a term so generously applied that nearly any emotion, sadness, excitement, boredom, irritation, could be placed under its wide umbrella. And because the labels were vague, the treatments became constants, and the women themselves became patients. Eleanor Harding first noticed the shift in her own household, not in her body, but in the way her husband Jonathan looked at her. He had always regarded her with a mixture of admiration and distance, like someone reading a treasured book but never quite understanding the plot. Yet suddenly there was something more in his gaze, something evaluative, something quietly diagnostic, as though each of her movements might reveal a symptom he had been instructed to watch for. It began with small comments. "You seem tired, Eleanor. You're pale again today. Your nerves appear unsettled. You should rest more. Dr. Pembroke said you must avoid strain." In truth, Eleanor wasn't tired, only bored. The long Victorian winters had a way of dulling everything. The days repeated themselves with the rhythm of a clock that would never stop ticking. Reading, mending, helping the maid, preparing tea, watching the fire, then watching it die. Those were her hours, her minutes, her life. But boredom, of course, was not an acceptable feeling for a Victorian woman, so it was repackaged as an ailment. It was safer that way. Dr. Pembroke,
a man with neatly waxed mustaches and a reputation for being both compassionate and thoroughly misguided, visited once every fortnight. His medical bag, always polished, contained more glass bottles than instruments. The bottles were the important part. They held the solutions to everything that troubled women, according to him. Most ladies suffer from delicate dispositions, he often said with gentle authority, as if offering a profound truth. The female system is highly attuned to emotional shifts. A man's constitution is like an oak tree. A woman's is like a rose, beautiful but in need of constant tending. Eleanor once asked him why women seemed afflicted more frequently than men. He smiled kindly as though she had asked something sweetly naive. "My dear Mrs. Harding, you possess a mind that wanders too much, that is all. A bit of rest, a bit of tonic, it will keep your nerves steady." Rest and tonic. Rest and tonic. Rest and tonic. The twin pillars of Victorian womanhood. Across Windermere, similar scenes unfolded in quiet drawing rooms and shadowed parlors. Women barely 30 moved slowly as if they were twice their age. Mothers in their 40s were treated like fragile china that might crack if spoken to too sharply. Daughters in their 20s lived in a state of permanent diagnosis, their emotional states monitored with the precision of an astronomer tracking stars. Louise Bennett, Eleanor's closest friend, had become so accustomed to the routine that she had memorized precisely what her doctor would ask each visit. "Have you been feeling fatigued?" "Yes." "Any heaviness in your chest?" "Indeed." "Difficulty concentrating?" "Sometimes." "Do you find yourself worrying more than usual?" "I suppose." Their answers were not lies, nor truths. They were expected responses, the ones that kept her from being questioned. The real question Louise asked herself was very different. "Do I feel anything at all?" But Victorian society discouraged women from answering that honestly. Emotions were too unpredictable, too unpolished, too revealing. Better to be a quiet patient than a complex person. And so doctors prescribed, husbands encouraged, mothers advised, neighbors nodded sympathetically. The chorus was always the same: you must take your tonic. For women, illness became a routine as common as brushing one's hair. Eleanor often stood at her bedroom window watching other women through the lace curtains. They walked slowly, carefully, as though balancing invisible burdens. They held small lives, small expectations, and small freedoms. And behind nearly every one of them, a tiny glass bottle somewhere in the house waited for its next use. The bottles were lined up in cabinets and cupboards across the town, like soldiers awaiting deployment. Some smelled of sweet syrup, others of mint, still others of bitter herbs. But beneath the carefully crafted scents, many hid something stronger, far stronger, something no one talked about in public and everyone trusted in private. In those quiet mornings, Eleanor asked herself a question she dared not speak out loud. Were women patients because they were sick? Or were they sick because the world demanded they act like patients? One particularly cold morning, as snow pressed like powdered glass against the windows, Eleanor found herself seated in the drawing room with Louise. The fire crackled, the air hummed with a comfortable stillness, yet something tugged at the space between them, a shared heaviness neither could quite name. Louise's voice broke the silence first. She said softly, "Do you ever wonder why we are always the ones needing treatment? Why the doctors never give these tonics to the men?" Eleanor set down her teacup carefully, the porcelain clinking with a soft note. "All the time," she admitted. Louise leaned back, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling. "My husband believes I worry too much, But I think something is happening to us, something they don't understand. Eleanor nodded, her lips tightening. Or something they caused. Their eyes met. There was a flicker of fear in both gazes, a recognition that they were whispering close to the edge of something forbidden. The Victorian world despised women who questioned too boldly. A curious woman was as dangerous as an ill one. But once spoken, the thought lingered between them, growing roots. That evening, after Louise departed, the house felt unusually silent. Eleanor's footsteps echoed softly across the hallway as she moved toward the mantel where her own bottle sat. It was small, amber-colored, and sealed with a cork that carried faint traces of medicinal scent. She lifted it, turned it slowly in her hands, and wondered how something so tiny could hold influence over an entire generation of women. A quiet era indeed, quiet because its loudest suffering had been gently muted with medicine and expectation. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor became more attuned to the subtle signs around her. The tremor in Mrs. Avery's hands, the sudden giggles that didn't fit Miss Clare's usual calm nature, the dizzy spells that left Mrs. Pembroke unable to cook supper, the restless energy that made Mrs. Hawthorne pace her garden at dusk long after everyone else had gone inside. Were these illnesses or symptoms of the very thing prescribed to cure them? The town did not ask. Perhaps it was easier not to ask. Easy answers make peaceful towns. Hard questions make troubled ones. And yet, the more Eleanor observed, the more her suspicion deepened. There was something else at work, something that doctors overlooked, or misunderstood, or simply accepted without question. Women were evolving into the constant patients because it served a purpose. A quiet, orderly society, a predictable household, a medical system built upon assumptions, a culture that preferred women slightly subdued, always manageable. The tonic, the rest, the diagnosis, everything aligned neatly. Eleanor felt it tightening around her like the laces of her corset, restraining, shaping, conforming. But she also felt something inside her resisting. A small spark, a whisper of rebellion she could not yet name. Then, one snowy morning, something happened that would change everything. Jonathan returned from town earlier than usual, stamping frost from his boots and shaking the cold from his coat.
The bottle wrapped in innocence. The bottle sat on Eleanor Harding's dressing table like a delicate ornament, so unthreatening, so dainty, so deceptively beautiful that it was difficult to think of it as anything harmful at all. In the soft lamplight, its amber glass glowed warmly, almost tenderly, as though it had been crafted to comfort, not control. Tiny bubbles clung to the sides, suspended like little secrets trapped beneath its lacquered surface. It was astonishing how something so small could exert such an immense influence over so many lives. Victorian homes, with their floral wallpaper and polished wood, had a talent for disguising troubling things beneath charming exteriors. A dangerous tonic could look like perfume. A harmful idea could be called tradition. Something meant to pacify could be labeled affection. The era was full of such contradictions, gentle on the surface, quietly ruthless underneath. This bottle was the perfect symbol of that contradiction. Eleanor reached out and brushed her fingers against the cool glass. She didn't open it, not yet, but even touching it felt like brushing against the edge of a secret she had never asked to keep. She tried to imagine the first person who had decided to place such a substance into such an innocent-looking vessel. Someone must have chosen the shape, the amber tint,
the little ribbon wound neatly around its neck. Someone must have said, "Make it beautiful, make it reassuring, make it seem like help." And so it did. When Louise Bennet first showed her own bottle weeks earlier, Eleanor had been struck by the same deceptive charm. It had a delicate cork stopper carved with swirling floral designs, and the pharmacist had packaged it inside a white paper box printed with promises. Restorative essence for ladies. Fortifies the nerves, calms the mind, sweetens the heart. Sweetens the heart. The world knew how to flatter women, even when it was poisoning them. Earlier that afternoon, the Harding household had been unusually quiet. Snow drifted against the windows in soft sheets, muffling every sound and creating a silence so deep it felt like a blanket wrapped around the entire town. Eleanor moved through the house in slow steps, her fingers trailing lightly across furniture polished to perfection. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, aware that something in her was shifting. At the dining table, she found the little note Jonathan had left that morning. His handwriting, always neat, always controlled, sat elegantly across the page. "Eleanor, please take the new tonic Dr. Pembroke provided. He believes this mixture will help steady your nerves further. I only want the best for you. With affection, J." It was a gentle note, kindly written, and yet Eleanor felt the weight of it like an invisible hand pressing lightly against her back. A nudge disguised as affection. The world loved to claim its rules were for women's benefit. But Eleanor was beginning to question whether benefit was merely another word hiding something else. Obedience, perhaps? Quietness. Compliance. Convenience. The tonic promised peace, but it asked for something in return. Her clarity. That evening, as the last embers in the fireplace dimmed, Eleanor found herself staring again at the tiny vessel. Then she slowly lifted it, holding it between her hands with the same caution one might use when holding a delicate bird. She turned it over, read the label. Ladies' Soothing Tonic, a gentle companion for the weary. The calligraphy curled elegantly around the glass like vines. It almost felt as though the letters themselves were trying to persuade her. She uncorked it. A soft pop whispered into the quiet room, releasing a fragrant scent that drifted through the air. Sweet, like blooming flowers pressed into syrup. Beneath the sweetness lingered something sharper. Faint, but unmistakable, like a shadow hiding behind sunlight. Eleanor lifted the bottle closer, inhaling carefully. Her mind flickered. This was the scent Louise had described as comforting at first, unsettling later. Mrs. Avery once said it made her feel lovely and unhinged at the same time. Miss Clare said it made the world too soft, too bright. Mrs. Hawthorne said it filled her veins with a false sort of warmth. And Eleanor, though she had resisted for days, suspected this new mixture was even stronger than the last one Dr. Pembroke had given her. She set the bottle down and walked toward the window. Outside, the snow-covered street glowed ghostly under the lantern lights. A lone figure trudged across the road, the milkman finishing a late round. His lantern swung at his side, scattering warm light across the mist like tiny golden embers. For a moment, she imagined what it must feel like to walk freely through town as he did, without eyes watching her for signs of frailty or nerves, without society labeling her body and emotions as something perpetually unstable. Men's moods were character. Women's moods were illness. Men's exhaustion was hard work. Women's exhaustion was weakness. Men's silence was strength. Women's silence was expected. How many tonics, she wondered, had been handed to women simply because their thoughts stretched too far beyond the boundaries drawn for them? Perhaps the bottle was not given to soothe women. Perhaps it was given to soothe the world around them. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Eleanor?" Jonathan's voice drifted through the wood. "Yes," she answered gently. He entered, wearing his slippers and his usual expression of polite concern. His eyes drifted momentarily to the bottle on the table, and he nodded approvingly. "I see you've opened it," he said. "I only examined it," Eleanor replied. Jonathan smiled the way a schoolmaster might smile at a child hesitating with a lesson. "There is nothing to fear. Dr. Pembroke assured me it is perfectly safe. Many ladies take it. Mrs. Pembroke, Mrs. Avery, even Mrs. Bennet." Eleanor hesitated. "Do you think they are all well?" Jonathan blinked, unprepared for the question. "They are improving. Or they seem calmer, at least. It is an improvement, isn't it?" Calmer. That word hummed in the room like a low, unsettling chord. Jonathan stepped closer and touched her shoulder lightly. "Take it, Eleanor. For your own peace." Then, with a kiss on her cheek, he left her alone. The door closed softly behind him. The house fell back into silence. The bottle gleamed. Eleanor didn't take it. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Instead, she sat beside it as though keeping vigil, watching the lamplight shine through it, casting warm amber shadows onto the wall beside her. A drug mistaken for a cure. Windermere woke under a pale winter sun the next morning, its rooftops frosted and white, and its chimneys breathing thin threads of smoke into the quiet sky. The air held a brittle cold, the sort that settled into bones and lingered long after the fire had been stoked. But inside Eleanor's home, something deeper than coldness lingered, an uneasiness born of the little amber bottle now hidden behind shawls in her wardrobe. It was astonishing, really, how something only inches tall could press so heavily upon the mind. Eleanor rose from her bed long before Jonathan stirred. She moved quietly across the floorboards, her steps muffled by the thick rug beneath her feet. Her hands were cold, but her mind felt strangely alert, as if the night's silence had sharpened her thoughts. She dressed slowly, pulling her hair up into a loose twist. Then she descended the stairs, the faint scent of last night's burned firewood trailing behind her. The morning room was awash in a dull gray light, dust motes drifting lazily through the air like tiny ships on an invisible sea. She stood at the window for several minutes. Outside, she saw Mrs. Avery walking down the road. Though walking hardly described it. There was a faint sway in her steps, a looseness in her movements that suggested her mind was floating somewhere far from her feet. She clutched her shawl loosely around her shoulders, her posture slightly crooked, her gaze fixed on nothing. Eleanor watched her until she disappeared around the corner. A drug, mistaken for a cure. That phrase drifted across Eleanor's thoughts like a whisper, uninvited and persistent. How many women in Windermere, in England, in all of Europe, were living under its influence? How many believed themselves unwell simply because those around them said so? Later that morning, after Jonathan had gone to his workshop, Eleanor decided to visit Louise. The Harding carriage had not been used in days, and its wheels creaked faintly as the driver set it into motion. Frost cracked softly beneath the hooves of the horses as they trotted down the narrow lane. Windermere looked peaceful, but Eleanor now understood that peace often grew from silence rather than harmony. The carriage arrived at the Bennett house, a charming residence with ivy curling around its stone archways. As Eleanor stepped out, she noticed a peculiar stillness drifting through the property. She knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened, revealing Louise's maid, Clara. "Oh, Miss Harding," she said with a polite curtsy. "Miss Louise is in the sitting room. She's been feeling a bit peculiar this morning." Peculiar. Eleanor felt the words settle like a weight in her chest. "I'll go to her," she said softly. Louise sat on a chaise near the fireplace, her hair slightly undone, her cheeks flushed. A half-embroidered handkerchief lay in her lap, the needles still threaded but forgotten. Eleanor approached gently. "Louise?" Louise turned her head leisurely, her eyes soft but unfocused. "Eleanor, forgive me, I didn't hear you come in." Her voice carried a lightness, a drifting quality, as if she were speaking through fog. Eleanor sat beside her. "You're unwell?" Louise shook her head, or tried to. The movement came too slowly, as though her body resisted its own commands. "No, I'm only a bit overwhelmed," she murmured. "The tonic Dr. Pembroke gave me, it helps, and yet it does something else." Eleanor leaned closer. "What else?" Louise hesitated. Her fingers twisted the embroidery thread absently. "It warms me at first, makes my heart feel light, makes everything feel dreamy. But afterward, Eleanor, afterward, I feel as though my thoughts no longer belong to me, as if they float away before I can catch them." Eleanor's pulse tightened. "And yet you continue drinking it?" Louise's lips curved into a fragile smile. "Everyone says I must, that it is good for my nerves, that it soothes me, that it protects me from distress." A soft, bitter laugh escaped her. "Protects me," she repeated. "But what if the thing meant to protect me is the very thing harming me?" Eleanor reached for her hand and held it gently. "That is precisely what I fear," she said in a quiet voice. Louise lowered her gaze. "I sometimes wonder if I would be better without it. But when I resist for a day or two, I feel so strange. My limbs shake, my thoughts grow loud, my heart races, I become afraid." Eleanor nodded slowly, recognizing the description. "It's not your illness, Louise," she said softly. It's the withdrawal. Withdrawal? Yes. She didn't know the precise scientific explanation. Few women did. But she sensed the truth of it deep within her bones. The tonic soothed because it created a need for itself. It calmed because it controlled. It cured nothing, but invented the very symptoms it claimed to relieve. A drug mistaken for a cure. Suddenly, Louise's voice lowered. "Do you know what frightens me most?" Eleanor waited. "I think I'm beginning to need it. Not for my nerves, not for any ailment, but because, without it, I feel as though something is missing, as if I am too aware, too raw, too awake." Her eyes lifted to Eleanor's, wide and shimmering. "I was not like this before." Eleanor squeezed her friend's hand gently. "You are not at fault." Louise inhaled shakily. "Then who is?" Eleanor said nothing, because she did not yet know whether the fault lay with Dr. Pembroke, with society, with belief, with ignorance, or with something far more deeply rooted. As the afternoon sun struggled to break through the clouds, Eleanor and Louise continued talking in low voices, like conspirators whispering truths too dangerous for the walls to hear. "Did you take your new bottle?" Louise asked suddenly. Eleanor hesitated. "No." Louise studied her, her expression slowly sharpening for the first time that morning. "Eleanor, you must be careful. They will notice." "Jonathan already has. And he believes I should take it for my peace." Louise shook her head slowly, her eyes darkening. "It is not peace they want for us. It is predictability." Eleanor's breath caught. "Yes, and obedience." A long silence stretched between them, one steeped in understanding. The fire crackled, the snow drifted, and Eleanor felt something within her shifting again. A new awareness, a new caution, a new resolve. She looked around the Bennett sitting room and noticed for the first time how many little bottles lay scattered across shelves and tables, each one innocent, each one dangerous. Some were half empty, some still full, some forgotten, some treasured. An entire age built upon glass bottles, an entire generation of women held in their amber glow. When Eleanor returned home that day, she found Jonathan in the parlor reading the newspaper. He looked up as she entered. "You were gone several hours," he said lightly. "I visited Louise," I replied, removing her gloves. "She's not well." Jonathan frowned. "Ah, yes. Dr. Pembroke mentioned she required a stronger mixture." Eleanor stiffened. "Perhaps the mixtures themselves are the problem." Jonathan blinked. "What do you mean?" She described strange effects, mood changes, confusion, distress. Should that occur if the medicine is helping? Jonathan folded the paper slowly, placing it on his lap. "Eleanor, you must understand. Women's nerves are delicate. It takes time for their systems to adjust." Eleanor's gaze hardened. "But what if they should not need to adjust at all?" Jonathan sighed gently, the way a man sighs when he believes a woman is saying something simply because she is emotional. "You worry too much. The doctor knows best." A phrase used so often, it had become a shield, shielding men from doubt, shielding women from truth. Eleanor said nothing more, but her silence wasn't agreement. It was calculation. That night, after Jonathan went to bed, Eleanor returned quietly to her wardrobe. She reached into the stack of shawls and felt the smooth surface of the amber bottle beneath them. She pulled it out, held it, turned it in her hands again. The amber gleam caught the faint bedroom light, casting warm shadows across her skin. What was inside it? What power did it hold? Why did no one question it? The women who slowly changed. In the early months of that unusually pale Victorian spring, a stillness seemed to settle over the town of Harrowwick, one so delicate, so deceptively gentle, that few noticed how the women who lived behind its curtained windows were beginning to change, not at once, not in the obvious ways that draw attention or raise suspicions, but in subtle shifts so faint they almost blended with the everyday rhythms of domestic life, and that was precisely why those changes went unnoticed for so long. It began, as such things often did, with Eleanor. For years, she had been a woman defined by her composure, quiet, graceful, reliable in her duties, steady in her moods, the type of woman people rarely described with passion, but always with respect. A woman of good temperament, the physicians like to say. A woman stable of mind, her neighbors added with approving nods. Yet the bottle had begun to alter something in her. Not in a violent, sudden manner, but like a low tide that stole the shore 1 inch at a time. At first, it was her sleep. Eleanor had always rested lightly but peacefully, drifting into slumber with the ease of someone whose days were structured, predictable, and well-ordered. But within weeks of the tonic becoming part of her routine, her nights changed shape entirely. She began to wake at odd hours, 2, 3, sometimes 4 in the morning, staring into the dark without knowing why she had awakened at all. Her heart beat faster than it should have. Her thoughts felt strangely scattered, like loose pages in a drafty room. Yet even then, she said nothing. Women, after all, were not encouraged to speak of such things. Soon after, another change followed. Her appetite faltered, not dramatically, but enough that Mrs. Pratt, the cook, remarked to the housemaid that the mistress hardly touches her plate these days. There was no malice in the comment, only confusion and perhaps a touch of worry. But no one thought it worthy of concern. Women's bodies, they said, ebbed and flowed like the moods of the moon. There were countless reasons for appetite to shift, and none of them demanded a physician's knock on the door. The next change, however, could not be attributed to the whims of nature. Eleanor, once so gentle in manner and speech, began showing signs of nervous excitement, restless energy that had no clear origin. She found herself pacing the front parlor while arranging and rearranging the placement of books on the shelves, moving them from one end of the room to the other with an urgency she couldn't explain. She would start a task, abandon it halfway through, and then return to it at an odd hour, as though it suddenly mattered more than anything else in the world. Her husband, Henry, noticed the behavior, but in the way husbands of that era often noticed things, with mild curiosity rather than true concern. "Spring has always made you a touch energetic," he said to her one morning as she fussed over a perfectly straight tablecloth. His comment was meant to soothe, not dismiss, but Eleanor sensed the subtle distance in his tone. She didn't correct him. She didn't tell him that her energy felt unnatural, like a force moving inside her rather than something rising from within. Instead, she smiled, though it cost her effort. The bottle was working its quiet transformation. But Eleanor was not alone in this shift. Across town, similar patterns were emerging in houses large and small. Lydia Farnsworth, known for her demure shyness, had become unusually talkative, speaking so quickly that her mother remarked with a nervous laugh that she hardly recognized her own daughter's voice. Mrs. Pettington, an older and dignified woman with years of social composure behind her, had begun laughing at strange moments, sudden, piercing laughter that startled even herself. In many homes, the servants whispered about the odd behaviors their mistresses had begun displaying. "She walks the halls at night," said one. "She speaks to herself in little murmurs," said another. "She bakes unreasonable hours," claimed a third, "and then forgets about the oven entirely." But because these changes were so varied, some women becoming restless, others lightheaded, others oddly cheerful, no single theory connected their behavior, and no one dared suggest that the tonic, so widely trusted and so elegantly packaged, might be the culprit. The drug was seen as progress, modern, scientific, civilized. No one wanted to believe something so refined could cause disorder. But the changes deepened. Eleanor found her mind drifting during conversations, losing focus entirely, as though thoughts were slipping through gaps she couldn't see. She would stare at a vase or a teacup for several seconds longer than necessary, unable to recall what she had intended to say next. Moments of clarity were followed by waves of disorientation, so gentle she hardly noticed them, and yet they unsettled her deeply. One evening, she realized she had been humming a tune for nearly half an hour without realizing she'd started. A repetitive, haunting melody she didn't recognize, the kind of tune that felt inherited rather than chosen. Another night, while brushing her hair, she felt an unexplainable urge to laugh, not because anything was funny, not because she felt amused, but because the laughter pressed against her chest like a bubbling force that demanded release. She stifled it with both hands, staring at her reflection under the dim glow of the oil lamp. She whispered, "This is not me." But the mirror gave no answer, only her face looking back, pale and slightly hollow. Her eyes, once calm and composed, held the faintest spark of something she didn't quite understand. Still, she said nothing. Still, she trusted the bottle. The slow changes continued weaving themselves into the patterns of daily life. Women across Harrowwick began engaging in behavior that seemed uncharacteristic not only to those around them, but to themselves. They acted impulsively, spoke with sudden boldness, grew irritable without cause, or fell into ways of melancholy that lingered like mist. Some grew oddly euphoric at unexpected moments, bursting into laughter in the middle of prayer or smiling to themselves while staring out of frosted windows. Others grew anxious, even tearful, with no clear reason. And yet for each reaction, whether joy, fear, energy, or confusion, there was always a doctor nearby with a comforting explanation. "Nerves, Mrs. Turner." "Fatigue, Miss Bellamy." "Female troubles, no doubt." "Overwork of the mind." "You must rest more." "Continue taking the tonic." The tonic was the constant prescription. It was becoming the constant companion. The women changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, but none of them could deny that something within them had shifted and was continuing to shift, little by little, day by day. Their personalities softened at the edges and frayed in the middle. Their thoughts moved too quickly or too slowly. Their emotions swayed like lanterns caught in a draft. Some part of them, some very essential part, felt as though it was slipping away, replaced by something unfamiliar. Yet they kept reaching for the bottle, not because they wanted to, but because by then they no longer knew how not to. The era was quiet, the women were changing, and the town of Harrowwick remained blissfully unaware that beneath its polished surface, something dangerous and irreversible was unfolding, one dose at a time.
When families noticed the difference. By late spring, the subtle shifts in the women of Harrowwick could no longer be entirely ignored. The change had started imperceptibly, hidden beneath the gentle routines of tea time, needlework, and quiet walks through the garden. But as days passed, the transformations became visible enough to prick the notice of those closest to them, their families. Eleanor Harding first noticed it in her own household, not as a dramatic upheaval, but as a sequence of small disturbances that accumulated until they could no longer be dismissed. The first indication came during breakfast, that sacred morning ritual of toast, tea, and careful conversation. She had poured the tea herself, carefully measuring each cup and set the table with precision. But as she handed her husband the cup,
she noticed a tremor in her fingers, a fleeting motion that left the china rattling slightly. Henry, her husband, observed it with a faint furrow of his brow. "Are you quite well this morning, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice polite but tinged with curiosity. It was the same phrase he had used weeks ago when he first noticed her irregular pacing, her restless energy, but this time there was something sharper in the question, an awareness that things were changing beyond explanation. "I'm perfectly well," Eleanor replied softly, forcing her hand to steady. Yet she felt the internal shift, the subtle pull that had been creeping through her mind and body for months. She could not name it precisely, but she sensed that the tonic, the same amber bottle that had sat innocently on her dressing table, was weaving its influence more tightly, threading through her thoughts, her moods, and her very will. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Harding, had been visiting that week, and she too noticed the subtle difference. She was a woman of exacting habits and keen observation, accustomed to reading the moods of the household with precision. "You seem changed," Mrs. Harding remarked later that day, while inspecting the lacework Eleanor had been embroidering. "I cannot say whether it is better or worse, but you are different." Eleanor gave a faint smile, one that contained both acknowledgement and apprehension. "Perhaps it is simply the change of season, Mother," she said, hoping to deflect the scrutiny. Yet she felt the undercurrent of tension in her own chest, a low pulse that whispered the truth she dared not speak. It was not the season that had changed her, it was the tonic, and the tonic alone. Across town, families were beginning to observe similar transformations. At the Farnsworth residence, Lydia's parents noticed the extraordinary speed and liveliness of their daughter's speech. She had always been quiet and contemplative, her words measured and deliberate, but lately she conversed with a rapidity that startled her mother and father alike, phrases tumbling one over another as if she were struggling to keep pace with her own thoughts. "Do you feel unwell, Lydia?" her mother inquired one evening, holding the teacup trembling slightly in her hands. "No, I feel alive, but not in the same way I felt before. It is odd." Her father, a stoic man who rarely allowed emotion to color his face, observed silently. He frowned, unsettled by the unfamiliar brightness in her eyes, the restlessness of her movements, the way her energy seemed to oscillate unpredictably. In another home, Mrs. Pennington noticed the sudden bursts of laughter in her older daughter, Emily. Emily had always been reserved, careful, cautious in her behavior, yet now she laughed at unexpected moments, sometimes softly, sometimes with startling abandon, often without the faintest hint of a joke. "It is peculiar," Mrs. Pennington whispered to her husband one evening, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I do not know whether to be pleased or alarmed. She is herself, and yet she is not herself at all." Even the servants, keen observers of their mistresses, whispered to one another in hushed tones. They spoke of odd routines, unusual temperaments, and nightly wanderings in rooms that had once been strictly private. Yet few dared speak these observations to the physicians who dispensed the tonic. The drug was seen as a cure, a safeguard, a protective measure. It had been wrapped so delicately in innocence that even suspicion seemed almost blasphemous. In Eleanor's own household, the difference manifested more than an outward behavior. It invaded the emotional atmosphere. Conversations, once calm and orderly, became tinged with unexpected tension. Eleanor herself noticed moments of heightened sensitivity, a fleeting irritation at Henry's habitual questions, a sudden sadness when she glanced at the lace curtains that she had stitched herself, or a brief, inexplicable swell of excitement while arranging her mother-in-law's teacups. Her younger sister Margaret, visiting for the week, noticed the changes more quickly than anyone. "Eleanor," she said one afternoon, her voice soft but direct, "you do not seem yourself. You are brighter, perhaps, but also frayed.
Is something troubling you?" Eleanor hesitated. Margaret's observation was precise, almost unnervingly so. It was difficult to conceal the effects of the tonic from someone so keenly perceptive. And yet, Eleanor had already decided that for now she could reveal nothing. "It is nothing," she replied carefully, forcing a calm she did not feel. But Margaret did not seem convinced. Her gaze lingered on Eleanor's hands, the subtle tremor still present, the restless motion that could not be entirely masked. "I think," she said finally, "that the world is changing you in ways you do not yet understand." Eleanor felt a flicker of unease, and yet a small thrill ran through her as well. Margaret's words were accurate, though Eleanor could not yet fully grasp the truth that she and so many other women were undergoing a transformation so profound that it touched not only body and mind, but spirit itself. As the days passed, Eleanor began to notice patterns emerging among the families she observed. Fathers and husbands, once blind to the subtle currents of change, began to register the differences. A husband might notice his wife's laughter lingering too long. A father might observe his daughter pacing at odd hours. A mother might sense the quickness of speech or the bright intensity in her daughter's gaze. These observations, however, were accompanied by uncertainty. How much of the change was natural? How much was the result of worry or imagination? And how much they feared even to contemplate was connected to the tonics that were supposed to safeguard their womenfolk. Some families attempted explanations. Perhaps the spring air invigorates them. Perhaps excitement at upcoming events, another mother offered. But even as such explanations were uttered, a faint unease lingered in the back of their minds, a shadow of suspicion they could not name. In the Harding household, the distinction became particularly pronounced during a luncheon one afternoon. Eleanor had invited several close neighbors to dine, including Mrs. Avery and Miss Clare, whose own lives had been touched by the same subtle changes. The conversation, initially polite and restrained, began to fray under the weight of an unspoken energy. Mrs. Avery, normally subdued, spoke rapidly about her garden and the unexpected growth of early tulips, gesturing with her hands more than usual. Miss Clare laughed lightly at a comment that had little humor, the sound bright and unexpectedly sharp. Henry and the other gentlemen at the table exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. They were trained in courtesy and social propriety, yet the subtle dissonance in tone, gesture, and expression rattled their composure. Eleanor observed the room quietly, noting the small tremors in speech, the erratic gestures, the flicker of heightened emotion that seemed to animate every movement. She recognized in these women the same transformations she felt herself, the same subtle liberation from rigid control tempered by an unseen influence. After luncheon, when the guests had departed and the house had returned to its usual quiet, Eleanor reflected on the events with both alarm and fascination. Families were noticing the differences, yes, but would they understand the cause? Or would they, like so many others, attribute these changes to the innocent passing of time, the seasons, or some ephemeral force beyond comprehension? It was becoming clear to Eleanor that the tonic, so universally trusted and elegantly packaged, was now a thread connecting each woman to a slow, imperceptible transformation. And while families noticed the effects, they did not yet perceive the true origin of these changes. The amber bottles sitting quietly on mantels and dressing tables, wrapped in innocence, but filled with an influence far more profound than anyone could admit. Eleanor wondered whether her own family would ever come to see it, not simply the shifts in mood or speech or energy, but the deeper, subtler alteration, the quiet expansion of thought, the glimmers of awareness, the sparks of independence that stirred under the surface, even while society insisted they remain docile. And in that moment, Eleanor felt a surge of something unfamiliar but vital, the realization that change was not
The chemical hiding in plain sight. By midsummer, Eleanor Harding had begun to understand, in quiet and unsettling clarity, the full measure of the tonic's reach. It was no longer merely a bottle of amber glass innocently sitting on a dressing table. It was a presence, a force, a chemical woven subtly into the lives of women across Harrowwick. Its influence was delicate, almost invisible, yet insidious, threading through the household routines, social gatherings, and even the most private thoughts of those who consumed it. The chemical was hiding in plain sight, as unremarkable as the delicate floral label that had first drawn Eleanor's attention months earlier. It had been presented as a cure, a balm for nerves, a gentle helper to those whose minds wandered too far, or whose hearts felt too acutely. Doctors praised it, families trusted it, society celebrated it, and yet beneath its amber glow and honeyed aroma, it carried a potency that few had the wisdom or the courage to recognize. Eleanor first began to suspect the true nature of the chemical one warm afternoon while visiting Louise Bennet. They had settled in the sitting room with cups of tea, and for a few rare moments they were alone, without interruption. Eleanor observed Louise carefully, noting her animated gestures, the unsteady rhythm of her speech, and the faint flush that colored her cheeks. "It's peculiar," Eleanor said softly, tracing the rim of her teacup with her finger. "The way it affects you, Louise. Do you ever feel as though your thoughts are not entirely your own?" Louise hesitated, her eyes widening as if Eleanor had spoken aloud the question she had struggled to articulate for weeks. "Yes," she admitted finally. "Sometimes I feel as though there is a fog in my mind, a warmth that comforts yet restrains. I am calm yet restless, light yet heavy." Eleanor nodded. She had felt the same sensations herself, the tug between awareness and sedation, the simultaneous relief and unease. She realized, with a quiet dread, that the chemical was not simply alleviating discomfort or stabilizing nerves. It was actively reshaping thought, perception, and emotion. That evening, back at the Harding residence, Eleanor examined the bottle once more. She removed the ribbon that had been wound around its neck, feeling the faint texture of the paper label beneath her fingertips. She could smell the faint sweetness of the liquid inside, floral and honeyed, yet there was something sharper now, almost metallic, lingering beneath the surface. She wondered who had first discovered the properties of this substance, who had decided it could be marketed, sold, and prescribed to women without their consent or full understanding. She imagined a laboratory somewhere, with men in stiff coats and round spectacles, testing the reactions of young women, measuring their pulses, counting their tears and laughter, recording the subtle tremors in their hands, the flickers of their eyes. The more she thought, the more she realized how carefully the chemical had been hidden, not in dark corners or locked cabinets, but openly, deliberately, under the guise of care and civility. It was present at every tea table, on every dresser, behind every curtain. It did not need to be secret. Its disguise was perfect. Families continued to trust it, to hand it out daily to daughters, wives, sisters, and friends. And because it was accepted, it became normal. And because it became normal, few questioned its effects. Eleanor began to study the subtle patterns it imposed on those around her. She noticed Mrs. Pennington's sudden bursts of energy, Lydia Farnsworth's rapid-fire speech, and her own moments of distraction and heightened emotion. Even minor tasks took on an odd rhythm. Arranging teacups, folding laundry, straightening books on a shelf, all were performed with a precision that seemed overlaid with anxiety and underlain by a restless energy. She began to realize that the chemical operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Physically, it seemed to alter the nervous system, calming certain involuntary tremors while stimulating others. Emotionally, it dulled some fears while amplifying fleeting excitements. Mentally, it created gaps in attention, brief lapses of thought, moments of clarity interspersed with unaccountable fog. And socially, it bound women together in a quiet, invisible thread. They were all affected, all subtly altered, all following the same rhythm imposed by the tonic. Even when families noticed the differences, they lacked the language, the knowledge, or the courage to challenge it. Eleanor decided she needed to understand it more thoroughly. She began keeping notes on her own experiences and those of the women she knew, recording times of day, dosages, moods, and observations. She did so cautiously, aware that even casual curiosity could be interpreted as impropriety. She wrote in her journal late at night, the only time she felt safe to reflect openly. "The chemical is everywhere," she noted. "It is present at the breakfast table, in the drawing room, at the sewing circle, even in the faintly perfumed air of the promenade. It touches the mind before the hand, the thought before the action, and yet it is invisible, perfectly disguised. Perhaps the brilliance of its concealment is its most dangerous feature." She also recorded the subtler effects she noticed in herself, moments of unusual boldness, sudden laughter, fleeting irritability, periods of intense focus that vanished without warning. All of these occurred shortly after she had taken her dose. It became clear that the chemical was not only a pacifier, but a manipulator, one that acted quietly and persistently over time. One morning, Eleanor visited Mrs. Avery, who had long been a model of composure in heroic society. She found her sitting quietly by the window, sewing, yet her movements were unusually swift and jerky. Her eyes darted from the window to her work, from her work to Eleanor, in a rhythm that seemed driven by an invisible conductor. "You look different," Eleanor said gently. Mrs. Avery looked up, blinking. "I feel different," she admitted. "The tonic, it comforts me, yet sometimes I cannot stop thinking too much. I do not sleep as I once did, and my hands feel both heavy and light at the same time. I do not know whether I am myself or someone else entirely." Eleanor recognized the sensation immediately. "It is the chemical," she said softly. "It is everywhere, in all our lives, shaping us without consent. It is meant to cure, but it imposes itself instead." Mrs. Avery nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "I feared it was only me, that I imagined these feelings. But if you feel the same—" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "It is not imagination. It is very real." The realization weighed heavily on Eleanor. She had spent months observing the effects, noting patterns, recording experiences, and yet the truth was inescapable. The chemical had been integrated into daily life so seamlessly that questioning it was almost impossible. Families relied on it, physicians recommended it, society approved it, and in its quiet, persistent influence, it shaped thought, emotion, and behavior in ways no one dared to admit. She began to understand why the tonic had been so widely adopted. It solved a social problem neatly and effectively. Women who were considered delicate, nervous, or emotional could be calmed and controlled without confrontation. Their unpredictability was softened, their exuberance subdued, their restlessness managed. But in doing so, the chemical stole more than just minor irritations or fleeting discomforts. It stole autonomy, subtly, invisibly. It replaced thought with suggestion, action with habit, individuality with conformity. Eleanor felt a cold determination stir within her. The chemical was hiding in plain sight, but she would not allow herself to be deceived. She would continue observing, recording, and questioning. And, if possible, she would discover the extent of its influence.
How advertisements fueled a quiet epidemic. By the summer of that year, Eleanor Harding began to notice a strange pattern, not only in her own life, but in the lives of women across Harrowick. The tonic, once merely a trusted household remedy, had become a symbol, a promise, and a subtle instrument of persuasion that reached far beyond the drawing rooms and sitting parlors. It was not enough that physicians recommended it. The very world seemed determined to convince every woman that she needed it, that her life, her health, her very nerves were incomplete without it. Advertisements had begun appearing with increasing frequency in newspapers, in flyers, and in small circulars slipped under doors. They were delicate in appearance, featuring flowing script and illustrations of serene women reclining on chaise longues, hands poised over teacups, faces pale but calm. Their smiles were gentle, the very picture of composure. The text beneath promised relief for the delicate nerves of every lady and tranquility for the mind, body, and spirit. At first, Eleanor had dismissed them as harmless marketing. She read a few, noting the florid language and the graceful illustrations, but she did not take them seriously. And yet, over weeks and months, she observed the advertisements' quiet but persistent influence. Women would read them aloud to one another during sewing circles, reciting the phrases almost as if performing a ritual. Mothers would hand them to daughters, emphasizing the importance of caring for one's health and temperament. Even fathers, when reading aloud to the household in the morning, would remark on the elegance of the remedy, nodding to its supposed benefits. Eleanor realized, with a mounting sense of unease, that the advertisements were doing more than promoting a product. They were normalizing the tonic's use, embedding it into the daily consciousness of women and families. They suggested that unrest, agitation, and emotional intensity were natural flaws to be corrected, not qualities to be accepted or understood. The message was subtle, almost invisible. If a woman wished to be calm, polite, productive, and socially acceptable, she must partake of the amber liquid. She observed these effects in her friends. Lydia Farnsworth, who had once been hesitant and shy, now discussed the tonic openly with other young women, quoting the advertisements as if they were scripture. "It is said to soothe the nerves," Lydia would say, holding the flyer with reverent fingers. "It brings clarity and calm. Mother insists I try it." In homes across town, Eleanor noticed similar behavior. Mothers praised the tonic for preventing unseemly fits of temper in their daughters, for easing the burden of delicate nerves in wives, for maintaining harmony in the household. The advertisements did not simply sell a product, they sold the idea that women's natural moods were undesirable, that emotional fluctuation was a flaw, and that only the tonic could restore proper order. Even women who had not yet used the tonic began to measure themselves against its promises. During promenades along the cobbled streets, Eleanor overheard conversations between young ladies comparing their own calmness to the ideal depicted in the advertisements. They spoke in whispers about the relief the tonic promised, their voices carrying both longing and anxiety. "The tonic is wonderful, I hear," one woman murmured to another as they passed beneath the summer sun. "Mother insists I should take it for my nerves, lest I disrupt the household." "Do you believe it works?" the friend asked. "I do not know," she admitted softly, "but everyone says I must try it." Eleanor felt a chill as she walked by. The epidemic was quiet indeed, not announced with alarms or proclamations, but nurtured by persuasion, subtle coercion, and a society eager to correct its women. The advertisements also reinforced the perception that women's lives were incomplete without external remedies, that domestic tranquility and personal peace were commodities to be purchased. The illustrations were meticulous, depicting women in idealized domestic spaces, parlors with lace curtains, gardens with perfectly trimmed roses, tables arranged with impeccable precision. Each scene suggested that calmness and composure were as much a matter of the tonic as of proper housekeeping. Eleanor reflected on her own household. She had carefully maintained her rooms, her manners, her appearances, yet she too had succumbed to the subtle guidance of advertisement and social expectation. The tonic had entered her life quietly, wrapped in the guise of care and refinement, and gradually it had shaped her moods, her energy, and even her thoughts. One afternoon, when her mother-in-law had come across a small advertisement tucked inside a Sunday newspaper, a delicate drawing of a pale, serene lady cradling a teacup, surrounded by the words, "For the delicate nerves of every young woman, restore calm, tranquility, and harmony with Dr. Pembroke's tonic." Mrs. Harding had read the text aloud, her voice soft and approving. "This is precisely what I have always hoped for, Eleanor. Your nerves are so sensitive, my dear. I do wish you would take it. It would bring such calm to your days." Eleanor had only nodded. She did not argue. How could she? The advertisement had created an expectation she could not easily dismiss, one that was reinforced by the careful observations of those who loved her, or thought they did. As the summer progressed, Eleanor began to see the broader impact. The advertisements had become a silent epidemic, instilling in women both the desire for the tonic and a subtle sense of inadequacy if they were not under its influence. It was not illness that compelled them to drink it, nor even weakness. It was a manufactured necessity, a socially sanctioned habit that had insinuated itself into nearly every household in Harwick. Women who refused the tonic were often gently, and sometimes not so gently, questioned. Mothers would express concern, sisters would whisper doubts, husbands would remark subtly on their wives' restless hands or distracted eyes. To refuse the tonic was to invite scrutiny, a judgment that one's nerves, temperament, or domestic aptitude might be insufficient. Eleanor saw this pattern play out at the Farnsworth home, where Lydia's mother insisted on daily doses, citing the advertisement as justification. "It is written here, Lydia," she said, her fingers tracing the elegant script. "The tonic brings calm, refinement, and composure. All young ladies of good breeding take it. You must too." Even the physicians were not immune to the influence of advertising. Dr. Pembroke and his colleagues had built reputations carefully, using circulars and illustrated pamphlets to guide public opinion. They emphasized the tonic's virtues while dismissing, with subtle authority, the concerns of those who might question its effects. The chemical was normalized not only in homes, but in medical practice as well, creating a network of persuasion that seemed impossible to challenge. Eleanor began to catalog these observations meticulously. She recorded the frequency of advertisements, the reactions of women, the subtle shifts in household routines, and the social pressures that reinforced compliance. Each entry revealed a pattern. The tonic's reach was multiplied by desire, expectation, and the quiet coercion of social norms. She also noted the behavioral effects: increased restlessness, altered speech, brief but intense moods of anxiety or excitement, moments of laughter without reason, and sudden lapses in attention. These manifestations were subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable when traced alongside the influence of advertisement. Even women who had begun with healthy nerves and balanced temperaments found themselves gradually altered by the chemicals' presence in their homes. Eleanor's own experience mirrored this observation. She felt her moods shifting, her thoughts meandering, her energy both heightened and strangely subdued, all in accordance with the repeated suggestion that she required the tonic. One evening, Eleanor observed a conversation among young women at a garden party. The topic had turned to the tonic, and the advertisements were openly referenced as evidence of its necessity. "It is essential," one whispered, holding the pamphlet delicately. "I would be lost without it. Mother insists, and I cannot refuse. How would the household endure my nerves otherwise?" Another agreed. "Yes, the illustrations are persuasive. Look at the serene lady. She is calm, content. Surely that is what we all strive to be." Eleanor listened from a shaded alcove, her heart heavy. These young women were not ill, they were normal. But the advertisements had convinced them that normalcy was insufficient, that tranquility was a product to be purchased.
The side effects no one expected. By late summer, Eleanor Harding had begun to notice that the tonic, once praised as a gentle aid to women's nerves, carried consequences far beyond its promised calm. What had been advertised as a soothing remedy designed to ease agitation, settle restlessness, and foster domestic tranquility was revealing itself to possess effects no physician, advertisement, or a society lady could have foreseen. The changes were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A fleeting flush on the cheek here, a tremor in the hand there, a momentary lapse of focus that passed almost as quickly as it appeared. Families noticed, but only casually, attributing these occurrences to overwork, the summer heat, or simple fatigue. No one connected the dots. The tonic was meant to help, after all, and who could imagine that the very cure would quietly produce new ailments? Eleanor herself experienced these side effects most vividly in the quiet hours of the night. She would wake suddenly, heart racing, her mind alight with thoughts she could neither control nor comprehend. Sometimes she would pace her room, hands twisting the edges of her gown, murmuring phrases that made no sense even to her own ears. Other nights she found herself laughing softly at memories or imaginings that seemed trivial, absurd, and yet impossible to suppress. It was not madness, strictly speaking, nor was it a breakdown of character or moral failing. It was something far stranger and more insidious, a reshaping of thought, emotion, and perception that left her unsure where Eleanor Harding ended and the tonic began. Families began to recognize these anomalies, though few could name them accurately. In the Farnsworth household, Lydia's mother noticed that Lydia's laughter sometimes erupted without cause, echoing too loudly through the drawing room. She would pause, a hand on her chest, unsure whether to scold or comfort. "Lydia, what are you laughing at?" she asked one morning, gently yet with apprehension. "Nothing," Lydia replied, her eyes sparkling, cheeks flushed. "It simply happens. I cannot stop it, though I do not wish to continue." Her mother frowned, glancing at the bottle of tonic sitting on the sideboard. It had been there for weeks, refilled without hesitation, regarded as essential for Lydia's delicate constitution. Yet the events of recent days, laughter that bubbled without reason, restless pacing, moments of heightened excitement followed by sudden exhaustion,
began to cast a shadow of doubt on that confidence. Similarly, in the Harding household, Eleanor's husband Henry observed changes in his wife that were both fascinating and troubling. She would sometimes drift in thought during ordinary conversations, her attention wandering like a bird startled into flight. Other times, her gaze sharpened, her voice carrying an unusual authority or urgency that he could not trace to any external cause. He mentioned it to Eleanor one evening, carefully, politely. "You seem different lately. Not unwell exactly, but altered. Is there something troubling you?" Eleanor smiled faintly, the gesture both reassuring and distant. "Nothing, Henry," she said. "Perhaps I am simply more aware. The world seems sharper, and I respond to it more vividly than before." And indeed, that was partially true. The tonic did not merely calm. It heightened, it intensified. It amplified minor thoughts, small anxieties, fleeting excitements, until the ordinary cadence of daily life became punctuated by bursts of irregular emotion and perception. The side effects were not uniform either. They varied from woman to woman, sometimes appearing hours after a dose, sometimes lingering for days. Some experienced sudden waves of energy, an irresistible urge to clean, organize, or write letters, only to find themselves later exhausted, their minds dulled and foggy. Others experienced emotional swings so subtle that family members only noticed in retrospect, recalling incidents that now seemed out of character or unnervingly sharp. Eleanor observed Mrs. Pennington during one afternoon visit. She sat at her embroidery, hands moving swiftly, almost violently, across the cloth. Her face was calm, expression composed, but Eleanor noticed the tremor beneath the surface, the restless, relentless precision that seemed driven by invisible currents. "You are busy today," Eleanor said gently. "Yes," Mrs. Pennington admitted, pausing to glance at her guest. "I feel compelled to finish this work, yet it is as though my own hands are urging me beyond reason. I tire quickly, yet cannot rest." The similarity of these experiences across women in Harrowick was remarkable. Eleanor recorded each observation in her journal, noting times, moods, and the minute details of behavior. The patterns became increasingly clear. The tonic, while ostensibly beneficial, produced secondary effects that were neither advertised nor understood. One of the most alarming side effects was a subtle distortion of judgment. Women became prone to impulsive actions or decisions they would not have made under normal circumstances. Small domestic choices, moving furniture, rearranging utensils, sending letters, were undertaken with intensity and urgency that seemed disproportionate to their importance. Some began to engage in minor acts of rebellion, speaking more freely, questioning authority, or resisting expectations they had previously accepted without thought. Eleanor herself noticed moments when she would challenge her husband's opinions softly but firmly, or when she would spend hours writing observations and thoughts she had never previously recorded. The tonic did not coerce these actions. Rather, it created conditions in which they emerged spontaneously, unpredictable, and sometimes alarming, even to the women themselves. The chemical influence was quiet, yet undeniable. It blurred the line between enhanced perception and compulsion, between expanded thought and altered judgment. Women began to inhabit spaces of experience that were at once familiar and strange, their personalities subtly reconfigured without their explicit consent. Families continued to struggle with interpretation. Was this the natural course of adolescents and daughters, of the pressures of domestic life and wives, or was it something far more intrusive? Physicians offered little clarity, often dismissing concerns as overinterpretation, nerves, or imagination. The advertisements, omnipresent and persuasive, reassured families that the tonic was safe, essential, and beneficial. In reality, the side effects were cumulative. Each dose added a layer of influence, amplifying tendencies already present and introducing new, unpredictable elements. Some women exhibited heightened creativity, others bursts of irritability, still others fleeting euphoria or melancholia. It was a landscape of subtle, shifting alteration, difficult to map and harder to resist. Eleanor kept meticulous notes, recording both her own experiences and those she observed in friends and neighbors. Her pages were filled with descriptions of restless pacing, unusual laughter, sudden tears, bursts of energy, lapses of attention, fleeting irritations, and moments of unexpected boldness. She noted correlations with dosage, time of day, and social environment. Slowly, a picture emerged, not of illness, but of transformation. The tonic was not simply a medicine, it was a force reshaping daily life, subtly bending minds, altering emotions, and influencing actions in ways that were neither wholly predictable nor wholly visible. One evening, Eleanor noticed an especially striking effect in her own behavior. She had intended only to read by candlelight, a quiet diversion at the close of day. But as she opened the book, she found herself reading passages aloud, emphasizing words in ways she had never done before. The voice carried energy, urgency, and cadence that startled her. She paused, heart racing, aware that this spontaneous expressiveness was not wholly her own. It was a revelation and a warning. The tonic did not simply soothe or calm, it amplified, distorted, and redirected thought and behavior. It created a new version of the self, one shaped by the chemical's subtle guidance and the pervasive influence of societal expectation. Across Heroic, the same patterns were evident. Women who had begun their routine with innocence were slowly transformed into actors in a new, unspoken drama. Their moods, thoughts, and actions were no longer entirely their own. Families observed these changes with curiosity, confusion, and sometimes apprehension, unsure whether to intervene or trust the familiar assurances of the tonic's advocates. Eleanor understood, finally, that the side effects no one expected were not anomalies, they were inherent to the tonic's design. It was not merely a remedy, it was a conductor, orchestrating thoughts, feelings, and behaviors across households, creating a quiet, persistent influence that remained largely invisible to those outside its sphere. She reflected on the advertisements, the physicians, the bottles lined nightly on mantels, and the subtle and insistent voice.
Society's blind faith in science. By early autumn, Eleanor Harding had begun to perceive a troubling pattern not only in the women of Heroic, but in the broader society itself. It was not merely the tonic or its subtle influence that held sway, it was the unquestioning reverence for science, medicine, and authority that allowed the substance to permeate homes with such ease. Families, physicians, and social leaders placed blind faith in the word of experts, in the promise of progress, and in the elegant rhetoric that framed the tonic as a triumph of modern knowledge. It began subtly in Eleanor's observations of her neighbors and friends. Women who displayed no signs of illness were nevertheless encouraged to take the tonic as a precautionary measure. Mothers insisted, daughters acquiesced, and husbands nodded politely, trusting that science knew best. The language of authority was pervasive. Phrases like recommended by physicians, proven to soothe delicate nerves, and endorsed by society's leading medical minds, adorned pamphlets, newspapers, and even private correspondence. Eleanor felt a chill as she realized the extent of this trust. The tonic had become a vessel through which society's faith in science was enacted, a symbol of collective obedience to knowledge that was accepted without scrutiny. It was not merely the chemical alone that reshaped women's lives. It was the combination of chemical influence and the unexamined authority of medical expertise, amplified by social expectation. During a late afternoon visit to Mrs. Pennington, Eleanor observed the subtle manifestations of this blind faith.
Mrs. Pennington had invited her over for tea, ostensibly to discuss domestic matters, yet the conversation inevitably turned to the tonic. "I see it is on your table, Eleanor," she said, gesturing toward the amber bottle. "I take it daily, of course. The doctor insists it is necessary for my constitution. One must trust in the science of our times." Eleanor nodded, her thoughts careful, deliberate. Yes, it seems wise to follow the guidance of those who know more than we do, though her heart carried a quiet unease. She had spent months observing, recording, and reflecting, and she now understood that the tonic's influence was intertwined with unquestioned authority. Mrs. Pennington's eyes brightened, reflecting the pride and confidence she derived from adherence to scientific guidance. Indeed, science provides certainty in a world so full of uncertainty. It is comforting to know that knowledge has progressed to a point where our nerves can be regulated, our health safeguarded, and our lives improved. Eleanor remained silent, careful not to betray her awareness of the deeper, more insidious effects. She knew that to challenge the blind faith in science was to invite suspicion, disapproval, and social censure, a risk few women of Heroic could afford. In her own household, Eleanor witnessed similar dynamics. Her husband, Henry, placed great trust in the prescriptions of the town's physicians, assuming that their recommendations were founded on rigorous knowledge. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Harding, took the tonic daily with an air of confident compliance, believing wholeheartedly that science had her best interests at heart. But Eleanor saw the evidence of its subtle influence everywhere: the tremors in her own hands, the restless energy that surged through her thoughts, the oscillations of mood that seemed beyond her control. It was clear that the tonic, combined with society's faith in its efficacy, created a powerful mechanism of influence, one that was largely unquestioned and silently reshaped the lives of countless women. Eleanor began to consider the broader implications of this phenomenon. The tonic was accepted not because it was harmless or beneficial, but because it carried the authority of science, a mantle that shielded it from doubt and scrutiny. Families did not question it, neighbors did not hesitate, and social conventions reinforced its use. Even women themselves, whose behaviors had been altered, often attributed their experiences to natural temperament or seasonal variation, rather than recognizing the subtle chemical and social forces at work. At the Farnsworth residence, Eleanor observed a similar pattern. Lydia's mother insisted that the tonic was essential, citing the doctor's recommendations as unquestionable truth. Lydia herself took the amber liquid dutifully, believing that science and authority had determined what was necessary for her well-being. "It is best to trust those who understand these matters," Lydia said, almost apologetically, when Eleanor expressed a subtle concern about her sudden restlessness. "Science knows what we cannot always perceive ourselves." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. She could see how easy it was for authority to shape belief, for trust in expertise to mask the quiet influence of chemical and social power. The tonic was not merely a remedy, it was a force, amplified by trust, reinforced by authority, and hidden in plain sight. The advertisements, too, capitalized on this trust. They often cited physicians, scientific studies, or the latest medical journals, presenting the tonic as the culmination of modern wisdom. Illustrations depicted serene, contented women, hands poised delicately over teacups, faces calm and composed. The imagery suggested that obedience to science through the use of the tonic was both virtuous and socially necessary. Eleanor noticed how this framing shaped behavior. Women who might otherwise have questioned the necessity of daily doses felt compelled to comply. Mothers urged daughters to take the tonic, husbands encouraged wives, and society reinforced the expectation of adherence. The chemical's effects were amplified by authority and social approval, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond the bottle itself.
Even physicians, often unaware of the full scope of the tonic's subtle influence, participated in perpetuating its power. Dr. Pembroke, a man of meticulous observation and careful language, praised the tonic's ability to regulate nerves and maintain composure. He rarely acknowledged the side effects, dismissing them as minor or temporary. Patients trusted him implicitly, assuming that his recommendations were grounded in careful research and rigorous study. Eleanor observed him in practice, noting the confidence with which he prescribed the tonic. His authority, combined with society's faith in science, reinforced the perception that women required the tonic for their own good. Yet Eleanor could see the disconnect between prescription and effect. The chemical reshaped thought and emotion in ways that were largely invisible, and those affected were often the last to recognize the change. At social gatherings, Eleanor noticed how pervasive this faith in science had become. Conversations among women often centered on health, nerves, and the proper management of temperament. References to the tonic were frequent, cited as evidence of wisdom, refinement, and adherence to modern knowledge. Those who questioned its use or its effects were met with polite but firm skepticism, as though doubting the authority of science itself was both improper and unwise. Eleanor observed a young visitor at a garden party, Miss Clare, who had recently begun taking the tonic. She spoke animatedly about the physician's advice, the recent pamphlet describing its benefits, and the necessity of compliance. "It is best not to ignore what the learned recommend," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Science provides clarity when our own senses fail us." Eleanor listened quietly, noting the almost ritualistic reverence for authority in her words. It was clear that the tonic's power extended beyond its chemical properties. It was reinforced by the unquestioned trust in the scientific voice, a trust that shaped thought, behavior, and even belief itself. Eleanor began to document these patterns meticulously. She recorded the observations of friends, neighbors, and her own household, noting how the tonic was framed as essential, how authority was invoked to enforce compliance, and how social expectations amplified its influence. The more she studied, the clearer it became. The tonic's impact was not merely chemical, but cultural, social, and psychological. The women of Heroic were shaped not only by the amber liquid itself, but by the pervasive authority that justified its use. Families, physicians, and society at large participated in a quiet orchestration of obedience, using the mantle of science to govern thought, behavior, and emotion. Science, once a symbol of progress and enlightenment, had become a tool through which autonomy could be subtly curtailed. As the days grew shorter and autumn deepened, Eleanor reflected on the implications of her observations. Families trusted authority blindly. Physicians prescribed with confidence. Advertisements reinforced obedience. Women complied dutifully. The tonic's chemical influence, subtle yet pervasive, was amplified by this network of trust and expectation. Eleanor understood now that to recognize the tonic's full impact was to question society itself, to see how belief, obedience, and trust could be harnessed to shape thought and behavior. And yet, she also recognized the peril of speaking such truths aloud. To challenge faith in science was to risk ridicule, censure, or exclusion. Still, Eleanor's resolve.
Doctors who did not realize the damage. By the chill of late autumn, Eleanor Harding had come to a quiet but urgent realization. The tonic's influence was far deeper than most could comprehend, and the very doctors who prescribed it, men regarded as learned, rational, and wise, were themselves largely unaware of the damage they had wrought. They were diligent in their observations, meticulous in their record-keeping, and confident in their authority, yet they failed to perceive the subtle, cumulative effects their remedies exerted on the women who depended upon them. Eleanor first noticed this during a visit to Dr. Pembroke's office. The walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound tomes and jars filled with powders and tinctures.
Dr. Pembroke, a man of impeccable dress and deliberate manner, greeted her with the courtesy expected of a physician attending to a patient of standing. "Mrs. Harding," he said, bowing slightly, "I trust the tonic has brought you relief?" Eleanor hesitated, aware of the fine line she tread between honesty and social propriety. "It has provided calm," she admitted softly, "yet there are moments when I feel altered. Restless, yet sedated. Energetic, yet subdued." Dr. Pembroke raised a single brow, his spectacles catching the lamplight. "Curious," he said, scribbling something in his ledger. "Nerves are delicate creatures, easily influenced by the seasons, diet, and the minutiae of daily life. Such fluctuations are not unusual, Mrs. Harding. I assure you the tonic is perfectly safe when administered as directed." Eleanor nodded politely, though inwardly she felt the stirrings of unease. It was clear that even the most learned practitioners were not observing, or perhaps not recognizing, the broader patterns of subtle, insidious change. The tonic was prescribed with confidence, yet its consequences were quietly escaping scrutiny. Over the following weeks, Eleanor began to catalog her observations of other physicians in Harwick. She noticed a recurring pattern. Each doctor relied on measurements of pulse, sleep, and appetite, rarely considering shifts in behavior, thought, or emotion as a relevant metric. They judged health in concrete, visible signs, yet the tonic's effects were often invisible, manifesting as restlessness, lapses in attention, heightened irritability, or bursts of uncharacteristic energy. In the Farnsworth household, Lydia's doctor observed her faithfully, recording notes on pulse and digestion, yet never inquired deeply into the subtle changes in her demeanor. Lydia laughed more readily, spoke with unusual sharpness, and spent hours organizing and reorganizing her surroundings, all actions recorded by Eleanor in her journal, but left unexamined by physicians. Eleanor realized with growing clarity that the tonic had created a blind spot for the very experts entrusted to oversee its use. Their methods were precise, their instruments accurate, their authority unquestioned, yet they failed to perceive the totality of human experience, particularly the nuanced interior lives of women. The damage, though quiet it was, went unnoticed. During a social gathering at the Harding residence, Eleanor witnessed another telling example. Dr. Latham, recently arrived from the city, was conversing with Mrs. Harding about the tonic's virtues. "It is a marvel of modern medicine," he said, his voice firm and assured. "A gentle, reliable means of regulating the nerves. Women of refined sensibilities require such care, particularly in these trying times." Eleanor listened as Mrs. Harding extolled the benefits of the tonic. "Yes, it calms the mind, steadies the hands, and soothes the heart. I cannot imagine managing a household without it," she said, smiling. Dr. Latham nodded, confident in his knowledge, yet oblivious to the subtle tremors in Mrs. Harding's hands, the restless pacing she undertook when alone, or the moments of laughter and tears that seemed disconnected from circumstance. These effects, Eleanor knew, were neither imagined nor isolated. They were the tonic's quiet influence, escaping detection precisely because the doctors focused on what was measurable, not what was profoundly experiential. Eleanor's own observations revealed the disconnect most starkly in her husband's interactions with physicians. Henry Harding, a man devoted to propriety and reason, trusted their judgments implicitly. He noticed minor shifts in Eleanor's behavior, her heightened energy at odd hours, her occasional moments of intense distraction, but dismissed them in light of the doctor's assurances. "Perhaps it is the season," he suggested one evening, "or the natural rhythms of the mind. Dr. Pembroke recommends no change. We should trust his judgment." Eleanor nodded, concealing the urgency she felt. She understood that the harm caused by the tonic was not dramatic, overt, or scandalous. It was cumulative, subtle, and largely invisible, escaping the attention of those who assessed health by the standards of measurement alone.
The doctor's inability to perceive the tonic's full effect was compounded by their own faith in authority, training, and tradition. They trusted the chemical formulations, relied upon their colleagues' reports, and deferred to the structured knowledge of medical literature. Yet the experiences of women, the restlessness, the lapses of focus, the oscillations of mood, remained underexamined, minimized, or attributed to imagination or temperament. Eleanor began to see a pattern emerging. The tonic operated within a network of blind compliance. Physicians prescribed, families trusted, women consumed, and social expectations reinforced the cycle. Even the most learned minds were unwitting participants in an experiment whose consequences they neither sought nor acknowledged. She documented these patterns meticulously in her journal, recording examples from the homes she visited. Miss Clare, for instance, had been prescribed the tonic at the insistence of her mother. Eleanor noted how her energy surged unpredictably, how she spoke with unusual authority, and how her attention oscillated between intense focus and sudden distraction. These were precisely the effects the doctors failed to observe, because their examinations measured only pulse, appetite, and sleep, ignoring the nuanced interior landscape of her mind. Similarly, Mrs. Pennington displayed bursts of uncharacteristic action, such as rearranging her entire parlor in the space of a single morning. She laughed and scolded herself in equal measure, bewildered by her own behavior. Eleanor recognized these patterns as the tonic's influence, but the physicians, relying on conventional metrics, remained unaware. Even when Eleanor spoke delicately of her observations to friends, the response was cautious. Women themselves were inclined to accept the authority of physicians over their lived experiences, trusting that those trained in science could discern what they themselves could not. This reliance, though understandable, further insulated the tonic from scrutiny. "It is best to trust those who understand," Lydia said softly, echoing the words of her mother. "The doctor has knowledge we do not possess. Perhaps my own perceptions are mistaken." Eleanor did not contradict her, though inwardly she recognized the quiet tragedy. The lived experiences of women were subordinated to institutional authority, their subtle suffering unnoticed, their autonomy diminished. The tonic and the network of trust surrounding it created a system in which even minor harms could propagate without detection. At home, Eleanor observed her own moments of altered thought and behavior, noting how quickly they were rationalized or ignored by Henry. Restless pacing, bursts of creativity, lapses of concentration, all of these were explained away as harmless quirks, the natural result of circumstances or fleeting whims. Yet Eleanor knew they were consistent, patterned, and chemical in origin. The doctor's focus on measurable external signs rendered such experiences invisible, leaving the damage unrecognized and unaddressed. Eleanor began to understand the paradox fully. The tonic's power was amplified not only by its chemical properties, but by the physician's blind faith in science itself. Authority, knowledge, and societal trust operated as extensions of the tonic, enabling its influence to extend beyond the bottle and into the very fabric of domestic and social life. During a visit to the town apothecary, Eleanor overheard a conversation between two physicians. "The tonic is harmless," one said, adjusting his spectacles. "The ladies benefit from its calming influence. I have observed no ill effects of note." "Indeed," replied the other. "The minor fluctuations in mood or energy are, I believe, natural variations, not consequences of the medicine. Our patients are quite content, are they not?" Eleanor listened from the doorway, heart heavy. The very men entrusted to understand the tonic's effects were blind to the subtle, cumulative changes she had observed. The chemical influence, she realized, operated in a space entirely beyond their measurements, shaping behavior, altering moods, and modulating thought with quiet precision. Eleanor resolved to continue her careful documentation. observing women's responses, recording changes in mood, attention, and behavior, and noting the cumulative effects that escape the notice of even the most learned physicians.
Women who became dependent without knowing. By the fading light of late autumn, Eleanor Harding had begun to observe a quietly unsettling pattern among the women of Harrowwick. Many had developed a dependence on the tonic without any conscious realization of the fact. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible transformation, one that unfolded not in dramatic crises, but in the quiet rhythm of daily life. Women who once approached the world with natural energy and temperament now found themselves tethered to a daily ritual they scarcely questioned, their autonomy gradually subsumed beneath a veneer of obedience and propriety. It began innocuously. A mother would encourage her daughter to take a small dose each morning, citing health, tranquility, and the recommendation of a trusted physician. The young woman, eager to comply, would swallow the amber liquid with a nod, hardly noticing the shift it produced in her mood or attention. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the tonic became a fixture of routine, unquestioned and necessary, its presence so intertwined with daily life that the notion of absence seemed impossible. Eleanor herself reflected on the subtle nature of this dependence. She had begun taking the tonic reluctantly, persuaded by both social expectation and the gentle insistence of her mother-in-law. At first, she felt nothing beyond a mild calm, a soft easing of the restless thoughts that sometimes troubled her in the quiet hours. Yet, gradually, she noticed that her days were structured around the tonic: a dose in the morning, a pause in activity, a quiet period to allow its effects to settle. The rhythm became habitual, so ingrained that deviation felt unnatural, even uncomfortable. The pattern repeated in countless homes. Lydia Farnsworth, for instance, took her tonic each day at precisely the same hour, following her mother's instructions and observing the practice of neighbors who, like her, had come to rely on it without conscious reflection. The young woman's moods and energy fluctuated in ways subtle yet undeniable. Brief moments of restlessness followed by languid calm, bursts of focus interspersed with sudden lapses of attention. Yet she attributed these changes to temperament, diet, or weather, unaware that the tonic had become quietly the scaffolding of her daily existence. In conversation with Eleanor, Lydia confessed, almost shyly, that she felt uneasy when a day passed without her dose. "I cannot explain it," she admitted softly, eyes downcast. "It is as though the day is incomplete. Mother insists I need it, and I trust her, yet I feel a strange emptiness when I forget." Eleanor listened with a heavy heart, recognizing the hallmark of dependence, a subtle, internalized need reinforced by social expectation and the chemical's own quiet influence. Lydia did not perceive herself as dependent, yet she was already tethered to the tonic's rhythm, her autonomy slowly eclipsed by habit and subtle compulsion. Across Harrowwick, Eleanor documented similar patterns. Women engaged in domestic work, social calls, and personal reflection, all punctuated by the presence of the amber liquid. Even those who began the tonic voluntarily often found themselves constrained by its rhythm, their moods and productivity influenced by whether they had taken their dose. The dependence was quiet, almost invisible, yet pervasive. Eleanor observed one afternoon in the Farnsworth garden. Lydia paused mid-sewing, glancing at the clock with a faint furrow in her brow. "The tonic," she murmured almost to herself. "I should have taken it hours ago. Perhaps it will help. Perhaps it is necessary." Her friend, visiting, noticed the subtle tension and asked gently, "Do you truly need it?" Lydia hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her handkerchief. "I do not know," she admitted softly, "but I feel uneasy without it. I cannot quite describe why." Eleanor recognized the words immediately as the expression of quiet dependence, a need that had emerged without conscious intention, nurtured by habit, social pressure, and the chemical's own quiet influence.
The women who became dependent often did so without recognizing the transformation. Mothers passed down the practice to daughters, emphasizing obedience, propriety, and care. Physicians reassured families of the tonic's safety and efficacy, never addressing the subtler effects on autonomy, thought, or temperament. Advertisements reinforced the perception that calmness, refinement, and domestic harmony could only be maintained through regular use. It was a perfect storm of subtle influence. The tonic provided calm, yet reshaped thought. It offered clarity, yet introduced quiet dependency. It promised composure, yet subtly altered judgment. Women believed they were exercising choice, yet their lives were increasingly guided by the amber liquid and the social structures surrounding it. Even Eleanor felt the tug of this dependence in her own routine. She noted moments when she would reach for the bottle reflexively, guided less by conscious desire than an ingrained rhythm. The recognition was unsettling. She understood the mechanisms at work, yet found herself unable to entirely resist their subtle pull. Families, too, remained unaware. Mothers considered the tonic a benevolent safeguard, fathers trusted the prescriptions, and neighbors admired the composure it seemed to foster. Dependence was masked as diligence, adherence, or refinement. No one discussed the inner transformations, the restless pacing, the sudden irritability, the bursts of attention, or the subtle anxiety when a dose was missed. All were quietly attributed to temperament, the season, or domestic concerns. Eleanor visited Miss Clare one morning, observing a young woman who had been taking the tonic for several months. Claire moved with precise energy, her hands never idle, yet her gaze flickered with restlessness. When Eleanor inquired about her daily routine, Claire spoke candidly, yet unknowingly. "The tonic, I take it each day. It is necessary. I cannot function properly without it. I feel distracted, restless, uneasy if I'm without it. But I believe this is simply how one must manage delicate nerves." Eleanor made careful notes in her journal. Claire's acknowledgement, though genuine, reflected the subtle blindness to dependence that had taken root in women across the town. It was a dependence cultivated without recognition, reinforced by authority, habit, and expectation. Even in private moments, Eleanor noted how her thoughts were shaped by anticipation of the tonic. She planned her day around the time she would take it, measured her energy and attention in accordance with its presence, and experienced mild anxiety when it was unavailable. The pattern was neither dramatic nor overt, yet unmistakably real. Her mind and mood were subtly aligned with the tonic's rhythm, a quiet dependence, unrecognized, unexamined, and largely unquestioned. She reflected on the social mechanisms that perpetuated the state. The tonic was lauded, administered with gentle insistence, and framed as essential for propriety, health, and social acceptability. Dependence was masked as diligence, adherence, or refinement. No one discussed the inner transformations, the restless pacing, the sudden irritability, the bursts of attention, or the subtle anxiety when a dose was missed. All were quietly attributed to temperament, the season, or domestic concerns. Eleanor visited Miss Clare one morning, observing a young woman who had been taking the tonic for several months. Claire moved with precise energy, her hands never idle, yet her gaze flickered with restlessness. When Eleanor inquired about her daily routine, Claire spoke candidly, yet unknowingly. "The tonic, I take it each day. It is necessary. I cannot function properly without it. I feel distracted, restless, uneasy if I'm without it. But I believe this is simply how one must manage delicate nerves." Eleanor made careful notes in her journal. Claire's acknowledgement, though genuine, reflected the subtle blindness to dependence that had taken root in women across the town. It was a dependence cultivated without recognition, reinforced by authority, habit, and expectation. Even in private moments, Eleanor noted how her thoughts were shaped by anticipation of the tonic. She planned her day around the time she would take it, measured her energy and attention in accordance with its presence, and experienced mild anxiety when it was unavailable.
The pattern was neither dramatic nor overt, yet unmistakably real. Her mind and mood were subtly aligned with the tonic's rhythm, a quiet dependence, unrecognized, unexamined, and largely unquestioned. She reflected on the social mechanisms that perpetuated the state. The tonic was lauded, administered with gentle insistence, and framed as essential for propriety, health, and social acceptability. Dependence was masked as diligence, adherence, or refinement. No one discussed the inner transformations, the restless pacing, the sudden irritability, the bursts of attention, or the subtle anxiety when a dose was missed. All were quietly attributed to temperament, the season, or domestic concerns. Eleanor observed the consequences quietly. Women who were once lively and independent now relied on the tonic to maintain composure, focus, and energy. Their decisions, behaviors, and even moods were shaped by the chemical presence, yet most were unaware that this dependence had formed. Mothers, daughters, and neighbors alike were
when the drug controlled the quiet hours. As the evenings grew long and the twilight settled over the cobblestone streets of Harrowwick, Eleanor Harding observed a phenomenon that both fascinated and alarmed her. The tonic had begun to dictate the rhythm of women's quiet hours, shaping their moments of repose, reflection, and solitude in subtle yet undeniable ways. These were the hours traditionally reserved for private thought, for candlelit reading, embroidery, or gentle conversation. Yet now they were increasingly governed by the amber liquid that promised calm. Eleanor herself felt the influence most acutely during these quiet hours. The hour after dinner when she might once have sat in her parlor with a book or journal was now punctuated by the careful administration of the tonic. She would prepare the dose with deliberate attention, as though some unseen hand demanded ritual and timing. Once consumed, her thoughts and emotions seemed to settle, her restlessness subdued, and her reflections molded by the chemical presence. At first, the effect was welcome. The tonic brought a calmness that made daily worries more bearable and domestic routines more manageable. Yet Eleanor soon noticed that her moments of reflection were no longer entirely her own. Thoughts that might have wandered freely were now guided, at times sharpened, at times subdued, in accordance with the tonic's subtle influence. The quiet hours, once a space of autonomy, had become a stage upon which the amber liquid quietly directed her behavior. Across Harrowwick, similar patterns were evident. Lydia Farnsworth, for example, had once spent her evenings sketching by the window or writing letters to friends. Yet now her activities were paced according to the tonic. A letter might be started only after consumption, a sketch left unfinished until the chemical influence had settled. Her moods, attention, and energy were quietly synchronized with the timing of doses, creating a rhythm that was invisible to casual observers, but palpable to those attuned, like Eleanor, to subtle shifts in behavior. The pattern was insidious precisely because it was invisible. Families praised the tonic's calming effects without noticing that it had assumed control over their daughters' private hours. Mothers regarded the quiet evenings as orderly and pleasant, unaware that autonomy had ceded ground to chemical regulation. Even the women themselves rarely reflected on the extent to which their choices were influenced, their actions guided by the gentle but persistent presence of the tonic. Eleanor's journal grew dense with meticulous observations. She recorded the timing of doses, subsequent behaviors, shifts in mood, bursts of energy or creativity, moments of restlessness, and subtle anxieties that emerged when the tonic's effects waned. Patterns emerged clearly. Women's quiet hours, once unpredictable and self-directed, had become regimented by chemical influence, their inner lives shaped without conscious recognition. She noted Lydia Farnsworth one evening, sitting by candlelight,
fingers poised above embroidery. The bottle rested beside her, amber liquid catching the flicker of the flame. She took a careful sip, then paused, hands trembling slightly. Moments later, her posture straightened, her attention sharpened, and she began stitching with precision that seemed almost unnatural. "It is necessary," Lydia murmured softly, as though speaking to the bottle rather than herself. Eleanor recognized this quiet declaration as a hallmark of control. The tonic dictated the pace of her thoughts, the rhythm of her actions, and the pattern of her quiet hours. The phenomenon extended beyond creativity or domestic work. Conversations, reading, reflection, all were shaped by the tonic's presence. Women would find themselves more talkative or reserved, more focused or distracted, precisely according to the chemical influence coursing through their systems. The once private interior landscape had become partially mapped, guided, and orchestrated by an external agent whose effects were subtle, pervasive, and largely invisible. At the Harding household, Eleanor observed similar patterns in her own routine. After taking the tonic, she felt compelled to tidy the parlor, organize correspondence, or write in her journal. Energy was heightened or subdued in cycles, often aligning with the timing of doses. The quiet hours, which might once have been characterized by spontaneous thought and unstructured activity, were now marked by regularity, attention, and chemical influence. Families continued to misinterpret these effects. Mothers attributed focused activity to propriety or diligence. Fathers assumed composure and calm were signs of temperament well managed. Even when subtle restlessness emerged, pacing, mild irritability, bursts of attention, it was rationalized as fatigue, weather, or seasonal variation. Few recognized that the amber liquid had assumed a quiet authority over the rhythm of daily life, guiding behavior with precision invisible to the unobservant. Eleanor noted a telling example at the Farnsworth residence. One evening, Lydia attempted to read by the window, her needlework forgotten. The tonic had been taken precisely an hour earlier, yet she still fidgeted, restless despite the prescribed calm. The anxiety, subtle but persistent, ebbed only when she resumed her domestic tasks, a pattern Eleanor recognized as the tonic's influence extending beyond prescribed timing, dictating both activity and repose. The control exerted by the tonic was often rationalized as beneficial. Families praised orderly evenings, noting improved manners, composure, and obedience. Mothers felt relief that daughters were calm, attentive, and productive. Fathers observed serenity, noting that women seemed more manageable and predictable. Yet Eleanor's keen observations revealed the hidden cost. Autonomy had been gradually ceded, private hours governed, and inner life subtly directed by chemical influence. Even the women themselves rarely questioned the phenomenon. They described their evenings in terms of calm, order, or propriety, rarely noting the extent to which their behavior had become contingent upon the tonic. What was framed as refinement or self-control was in many cases chemical orchestration of thought, mood, and attention. Eleanor reflected on the broader implications of this quiet control. The tonic did not merely soothe, it structured interior time, regulated emotion, and subtly molded thought. Women who had once experienced spontaneous creativity, unfettered reflection, and irregular energy were now bound to a rhythm imposed externally, their private hours silently dictated by chemical influence. At social visits, she observed this dynamic repeated. Women arrived, calm and composed, ready to engage in polite conversation. Their thoughts and actions were aligned, their energy moderated, and their behavior synchronized to the pace set by the tonic. Even in moments of supposed leisure, Eleanor noted the invisible influence: laughter measured, conversation orderly, and attention focused according to the regimen established by chemical rhythm. Eleanor's journal recorded moments of resistance as well as compliance. Occasionally, a woman would attempt to act independently, to engage in activity before the tonic had taken effect or after its influence had waned. These moments were often marked by discomfort, restlessness, mild anxiety, distraction, reminding Eleanor of the quiet power the tonic held over thought and behavior. In Lydia's case, attempting to read before her evening dose resulted in agitation and distraction. Her hands trembled slightly, her gaze wandered, and her thoughts refused to settle. Once the tonic was taken, composure returned, yet Eleanor observed the underlying truth. Even autonomy was now mediated by chemical influence, subtly but persistently directing the rhythm of quiet hours. The social expectation further reinforced the orchestration of evening behavior. Conversations praised calmness, structured activity, and composure. Women internalized these expectations, aligning their private hours with the anticipated norms, unaware that the tonic had amplified and guided the alignment. The amber liquid, social approval, and authority operated in concert, shaping interior life with quiet precision. Eleanor recognized that the control exerted by the tonic extended beyond
Friends who shared the same symptoms. By the first frost of winter, Eleanor Harding began noticing a quiet pattern among her circle of acquaintances. The symptoms, subtle yet persistent, seemed to echo from one woman to another, as though the tonic had created a shared rhythm of influence that extended beyond individual households. What was once considered private, personal experience now appeared communal, a subtle network of chemical and social alignment in which laughter, restlessness, bursts of energy, and languid calm resonated across drawing rooms and parlors alike. It began one afternoon with Lydia Farnsworth and Miss Clare in Eleanor's parlor. The two young women, seated with embroidery and writing materials, each displayed subtle signs Eleanor had learned to recognize: restive fingers, flickering attention, oscillating energy. Lydia spoke first, almost tentatively. "I do not know if it is simply me," she said, voice lowered, "but I find myself sometimes agitated, at other times calm beyond reason. The tonic, perhaps, or something else." Miss Clare's gaze flickered, a faint blush on her cheeks. "I thought it was only me," she murmured. "I have noticed nights when I cannot rest, yet days when I am almost too still, too restrained. Is this the tonic, Lydia?" Eleanor listened, her heart heavy. The pattern she had observed in isolated households was now visible across friendships: shared symptoms, mirrored experiences, a subtle but undeniable network of chemical and social influence. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's observations deepened. She noted how women who met for social visits, sewing circles, garden gatherings, or casual afternoon tea frequently discussed their states of calm, restlessness, or bursts of unexpected energy, often without connecting these experiences to the tonic they all consumed. "It is so strange," Lydia remarked one afternoon. "I feel a sudden wave of energy when Miss Clare and I converse. Yet moments later, I am languid, barely able to lift my hands to stitch." Miss Clare nodded, eyes thoughtful. "And I feel the same, almost as if our moods reflect one another. It is uncanny, yet I cannot deny it." Eleanor recognized this phenomenon immediately.
The tonic's influence was not confined to the solitary consumption of amber liquid. It seemed to create a ripple across households, subtly synchronizing behavior, mood, and energy among friends who shared both habit and social expectation. Eleanor reflected on the mechanisms behind this curious alignment. Chemical influence alone could not explain the synchronization of symptoms across separate households. Social expectation, conversation, and mutual observation amplified the tonic's influence, creating a network of shared experience in which the subtle shifts in one woman's mood or energy were mirrored, reflected, and reinforced in another. Even casual visits contributed to this phenomenon. Women arrived calm, composed, and orderly, yet Eleanor noticed the underlying oscillations, bursts of attention, moments of restlessness, fleeting irritability. These symptoms, while subtle, were readily observable to a keen eye and seemed to ripple across her social circle, unacknowledged by the participants themselves. One particularly revealing afternoon, Eleanor invited several friends to her parlor for tea. Lydia, Miss Clare, and 2 other acquaintances arrived promptly, each carrying a small dose of the tonic in their handbags, a ritual they followed without conscious reflection. As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor observed the subtle interplay of symptoms. Lydia's attention flickered from conversation to embroidery and back again. Miss Clare's hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup. Another young woman, Mrs. Alcott, displayed mild restlessness, pacing in the corners of the room before resuming her seat with a languid sigh. Eleanor noted the timing carefully. Moments after consuming the tonic, the women's moods and energies shifted almost in unison. Lydia's agitation subsided, Miss Clare's hands stilled, Mrs. Alcott's pacing ceased. The quiet chemical orchestra had achieved a delicate synchronization, a shared rhythm across multiple individuals whose experiences were intertwined by habit, expectation, and chemical influence. The conversation turned to the tonic itself, though in guarded terms. "I sometimes feel peculiar after taking it," Mrs. Alcott admitted softly. "Not ill, but changed. Perhaps it is simply the nerves or the season, yet I cannot quite describe it." Lydia nodded, almost nervously. "Yes, I have noticed the same. Moments of restlessness, followed by a calm I cannot fully explain. It is the tonic, perhaps, yet it seems to affect us in ways I had not imagined." Miss Clare, looking between them, spoke quietly. "And yet, we are not alone. I have observed the same with friends I visit and even my own mother. The symptoms, restlessness, agitation, calm, are almost mirrored among us." Eleanor recorded every detail, understanding the subtle but profound phenomenon taking shape. The tonic had become a social and chemical thread, linking women across households and social gatherings, producing shared experiences they could not consciously articulate. Even outside the parlor, the pattern persisted. Eleanor noticed it during walks in the garden, casual visits to neighbors, and encounters on the street. Women who took the tonic exhibited similar rhythms of behavior, pacing, bursts of attention, restlessness, or languid calm, often in parallel to those around them. As if the amber liquid had not only shaped individual lives, but had created a shared tempo, a subtle collective influence that extended across families, friendships, and social networks. In her journals, Eleanor documented these moments meticulously. The timing of doses, observable shifts in behavior, interactions among friends, and the interplay of chemical influence and social expectation. Patterns emerged with remarkable clarity. The tonic's effects were amplified through shared experience, conversation, and observation, producing a network of synchronized symptoms that was invisible to most, but discernible to a careful, attentive observer. Eleanor considered the social consequences of this phenomenon. Women's shared symptoms were often interpreted as temperament, seasonality, or emotional refinement. Mothers praised composure, Friends admired calmness, and even irritability was rationalized as a minor flaw of disposition. The chemical influence, though pervasive and subtle, remained largely invisible precisely because it was mirrored, reinforced, and normalized across social networks. One evening, during a private conversation with Lydia, Eleanor probed gently. "Do you ever notice that your moods seem aligned with those of your friends?" Lydia hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, now that you mention it, when Miss Clare is restless, I feel my own mind twitch, my hands shake. When she is calm, I feel compelled to sit still, to organize, to observe. It is strange, yet undeniable." Eleanor's pen moved quickly across the page, noting the invisible threads connecting social interaction, chemical influence, and shared experience. The tonic had created a subtle, almost imperceptible network of synchronization, one that shaped behavior, mood, and thought across multiple individuals. The shared symptoms extended beyond observable behavior to interior experience. Women reported moments of fleeting anxiety, sudden clarity, bursts of creativity, or inexplicable fatigue, all occurring in parallel with friends who shared the habit of tonic consumption. Conversations about these experiences were often guarded, framed in terms of propriety, refinement, or health, yet Eleanor could discern the underlying pattern. Chemical influence had become intertwined with social interaction, producing a web of shared, unrecognized dependence. Even Eleanor herself was not immune. She noticed subtle echoes of the tonic's rhythm in her own experience. Moments of agitation following a friend's restlessness, bursts of attention mirrored from Lydia's energy, waves of calm aligning with Miss Clare's composure. The synchronization was subtle, often unconscious, yet profoundly influential on her daily life and the lives of those around her. During another afternoon gathering, Eleanor observed a telling interaction. Miss Clare, slightly agitated, placed her teacup down with a soft clink. Moments later, Lydia's fingers trembled as she adjusted her embroidery. Mrs. Alcott paused in her pacing, glancing nervously toward the window. The shared symptoms were tangible, observable, yet unremarkable to the women themselves. "It is almost as if we are linked," Miss Clare said quietly, a hint of wonder in her voice. "I feel the shifts in my friends as if they were my own. Yet we are separate households, separate lives." Eleanor nodded silently, recording the moment. She understood fully that the tonic, combined with social observation, habit, and expectation, had created a network of subtle synchronization, a phenomenon that extended beyond individual households.
Husbands who blamed everything except the medicine. As winter deepened and frost traced delicate patterns upon the windows of Harrowwick, Eleanor Harding could not help but notice a recurring phenomenon within the households she visited. The husbands, diligent in their observations yet limited in perception, seemed to assign blame for the subtle changes in their wives to everything except the tonic that shaped their moods, energies, and actions. Fathers, brothers, and husbands alike identified fatigue, temperament, the weather, the rigors of domestic management, or even the moral fortitude of women as explanations for restlessness or agitation. But rarely did the amber liquid, ever present and quietly potent, enter their considerations. Henry Harding himself was no exception. A man of reason, propriety, and careful observation, he noticed subtle changes in Eleanor's moods. Some evenings, she appeared unusually restless, her hands fidgeting or her eyes tracing patterns along the walls. On other nights, she seemed excessively languid, her attention wandering despite her best efforts to focus on domestic correspondence or reading. Yet Henry, like other men of his class in understanding, did not attribute these fluctuations to the tonic she faithfully took each day. Instead, he offered other rationalizations, each more plausible than the last. "It must be the season," he suggested one evening as Eleanor paused from her needlework. "The chill and damp play upon the nerves. One must take care, that is all." Eleanor's journal notes recorded her quiet dismay.
The tonic's subtle influence was invisible to the very person most intimately connected to her life, a truth she recognized with growing frustration. Henry's observations were accurate, but his interpretations missed the substance of the matter entirely. The chemical orchestration behind her moods, energies, and quiet moments of agitation. Across Harrowwick, similar patterns unfolded. Husbands noticed changes but rarely considered the tonic. Mr. Farnsworth, observing his daughter Lydia's oscillations of energy and attention, suggested fatigue from household duties or the caprices of youth. Mr. Alcott, seeing his wife's occasional irritability and bursts of unexpected focus, attributed them to nerves unsettled by social obligations or the influence of the weather. The amber liquid, quietly present in every household, was ignored, taken for granted, or assumed innocuous by those entrusted with overseeing domestic well-being. Eleanor recorded a telling instance during a visit to the Farnsworth residence. Lydia had been unusually restless that morning, moving from embroidery to letter writing, pausing frequently to adjust curtains or rearrange her sewing basket. Her father, observing from the doorway, spoke in a calm voice. "You seem fidgety, my dear. Perhaps you did not rest well last night, or perhaps the work of the morning weighs heavily." Lydia shook her head slightly but said nothing. The tonic, faithfully consumed that morning, remained unmentioned, its influence entirely absent from her father's analysis. Eleanor's pen traced the subtle irony. The very substance that orchestrated Lydia's behavior remained invisible to the patriarchal eye, misattributed to circumstance, temperament, or domestic routine. Henry Harding's own misattributions were gentle, well-intentioned, yet revealing. He observed Eleanor's restlessness, noted her bursts of energy, and considered explanations ranging from seasonal melancholy to the strain of social obligations. On nights when she appeared calm beyond expectation, he praised her composure and assumed it was her natural temperament or a reflection of moral fortitude. The tonic, quietly guiding her moods and energies, remained outside his sphere of perception. This misattribution, Eleanor realized, was common. Husbands relied on observation but lacked the tools or the inclination to interpret subtle chemical influence. They trusted authority, physicians, social norms, and established remedies. The tonic was considered benign, a proper instrument of refinement rather than a subtle architect of behavior. During a visit to the Farnsworth parlor, Eleanor observed a similar pattern among Lydia's acquaintances. Friends' husbands, noting the subtle oscillations in energy, attention, and restlessness, speculated with varying degrees of seriousness. The weather, diet, fatigue from domestic labor, or even emotional temperament. The amber liquid, quietly present in every household, was ignored, taken for granted, or assumed innocuous by those entrusted with overseeing domestic well-being. Mr. Farnsworth, observing Lydia's hands fidgeting with embroidery thread, spoke gravely. "You must temper your energy, my dear. There is too much agitation in the house, too much restless thought. Perhaps a walk in the garden will settle your mind." Lydia nodded meekly, yet inwardly, Eleanor knew the pattern was chemical, not moral or behavioral. The tonic dictated rhythm, mood, and energy, yet patriarchy, custom, and social assumptions obscured this truth. Husbands blamed everything, examined everything, except the medicine itself. Eleanor's journals reflected both observation and reflection. She noted moments when husbands attributed changes to food, chores, or temperament, often suggesting remedies in turn: warm teas, extra rest, or a brief walk in the courtyard. Each intervention, though well-meaning, overlooked the subtle orchestration of thought and behavior produced by the tonic. Even the most observant men were limited by their assumptions. Their understanding of women's interior lives was constrained by social expectations and prevailing medical thought, which emphasized propriety, composure, and external symptoms rather than the subtle chemical effects of the remedies they prescribed or condoned. The tonic, therefore, escaped scrutiny, operating quietly within the household, guiding mood and energy with invisible authority. One particularly telling instance occurred in Eleanor's own home. She had been restless one evening, pacing the parlor, adjusting furniture, and glancing repeatedly at the clock.
Henry, observing from his chair, frowned slightly. "You seem distracted tonight, my dear. Are the children unsettled, or perhaps the weather weighs upon you?" Eleanor smiled faintly, concealing the truth. The tonic, taken as usual, had subtly guided her actions, influencing thought and energy. The pacing, the restlessness were not the result of circumstance, yet Henry's interpretations reflected a broader pattern. Husbands blamed all else but the medicine, their reasoning constrained by social, cultural, and medical assumptions. Even in social visits, Eleanor observed husbands misattributing symptoms. Mr. Alcott, noting his wife's occasional bursts of energy and subsequent languor, suggested that the weather, family obligations, or fatigue were responsible. Mr. Pembroke, conversing with a neighbor, noted similar patterns, attributing irregularity of behavior to temperament, diet, or seasonal effects. The tonic's influence, though pervasive, was invisible, normalized, and outside the men's domain of consideration. Eleanor began to understand the structural nature of this oversight. Husbands, like patriarchs across England and beyond, relied on observation guided by social and medical norms. The tonic, framed as a proper remedy, escaped blame precisely because it was sanctioned by authority, recommended by physicians, and socially accepted as beneficial. In short, it operated with impunity, its subtle orchestration of mood and behavior unrecognized by the very individuals whose insight might have revealed it. During a visit to Lydia Farnsworth's home, Eleanor recorded a particularly illustrative moment. Lydia had begun her tonic in the morning, and by mid-afternoon, her energy oscillated between bursts of creativity and moments of languor. Her father, observing from the doorway, commented on her temperament. "You are unusually spirited today, my dear. Perhaps too spirited. Control yourself, lest agitation overtake calm." Lydia's response was measured, polite, and compliant. The chemical influence was entirely unmentioned. Eleanor, observing closely, recognized the pattern. The tonic's effects were attributed to temperament, behavior, or circumstance, yet the medicine itself, the source of subtle orchestration, was entirely absolved. This misattribution was reinforced by social expectation. Husbands expected propriety, composure, and diligence. They noted deviations, assigned blame, and suggested remedies in line with custom. The tonic, sanctioned by physicians and society, was presumed harmless, even virtuous, and therefore beyond question. Its effects, subtle yet pervasive, were insulated from scrutiny by the very individuals whose insight might have revealed them. Eleanor documented these patterns meticulously, noting timing, dosage, observable shifts in mood, bursts of energy, moments of restlessness, and husbands' interpretations. The evidence was clear. Husbands, in their well-intentioned reasoning, misattributed the effects of the tonic, blaming all else, while the medicine quietly shaped behavior, thought, and interior experience. Even Henry Harding, attentive and loving, could not perceive the subtle orchestration of mood and energy imposed by the tonic. He observed, interpreted, and suggested, yet his understanding was constrained by the limitations of patriarchal perception and social expectation. Eleanor recorded these interactions with growing concern and fascination. The amber liquid, celebrated as a remedy, remained beyond the purview of the men who trusted it implicitly, their reasoning guided by convention rather than chemical truth. The women, meanwhile, continued to consume the tonic obediently, their behaviors shaped, their rhythms guided, and their interior lives orchestrated by a force invisible yet pervasive. Husbands,
The moment the truth began unfolding. The first rays of spring sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Eleanor Harding's parlor, casting long, delicate beams across polished wood and the lace-draped furniture. It was in these quiet, contemplative hours that Eleanor began to perceive a subtle shift in understanding, a moment when the truth of the tonic, the quiet architect of moods, energy, and interior life, started to unfold before her eyes. For months, Eleanor had observed, recorded, and reflected on the rhythm of the amber liquid and its pervasive influence over the women of Harrowwick. She had documented dependence, subtle synchronization among friends, and husbands' misattributions.
Yet, until now, the magnitude of the phenomenon had remained partially obscured. The morning of that day, however, offered a clarity that pierced through layers of assumption, social expectation, and habit. It began with a letter delivered from Lydia Farnsworth, arriving neatly folded and perfumed. The handwriting was precise, measured, and unusually contemplative. Lydia wrote of restlessness, of moments when her thoughts seemed dictated not by her own will, but some invisible rhythm she could not name. She described bursts of energy, alternating with waves of languor, the sensations mirrored in friends, yet unaccounted for by her household, her parents, or her physician. Eleanor read the letter slowly, each word sharpening her understanding. Here was evidence not merely of dependence, but of an intricate network of chemical influence intertwined with social observation, a revelation that connected months of fragmented observation into a coherent pattern. Later that afternoon, Eleanor convened a small gathering of close friends under the guise of casual social visitation. Lydia, Miss Clare, and a few others were present, each carrying the familiar amber tonic. Conversations began with polite inquiry, yet gradually shifted to confessions and observations, spurred by Eleanor's gentle questions. I have felt, at times, as though my mind is not entirely my own, Lydia confessed quietly, her hands resting on the lace tablecloth. I follow the rhythms of the tonic, yet sometimes I catch myself wondering if I ever had freedom without it. Miss Clare nodded, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. And I have noticed the same. I feel my moods, my attention, my very energy rising and falling in ways that seem guided by something beyond me. When I observe my friends, I notice it mirrors my own experience. It is uncanny. The room fell silent. The only sound, the faint ticking of the clock. Eleanor felt the weight of the moment. Recognition, acknowledgement, and a growing awareness that the tonic's influence was no longer merely personal, but communal, a phenomenon spanning households and friendships alike. Eleanor's thoughts turned inward. She reflected on her own quiet hours, her meticulous journals, and the observations that had led her to this realization. The tonic had not merely altered behavior, it had orchestrated rhythms of thought, attention, and mood. What had appeared as propriety, diligence, or temperament was now revealed as chemical guidance, subtle yet pervasive, shaping interior life without conscious recognition. She remembered moments in her own home when bursts of restlessness, sudden attention, or languid calm aligned precisely with the timing of doses, moments previously dismissed as coincidence, temperament, or the influence of routine. Now, viewed in the broader pattern, these were unmistakable, the effects of the tonic, quietly unfolding, regulating daily life with invisible precision. The revelation extended beyond immediate observation. Eleanor considered the rule of physicians, husbands, and social expectation. The tonic, recommended and sanctioned, escaped scrutiny. Husbands blamed fatigue, temperament, or duty. Physicians praised composure and propriety. Society accepted calm as refinement. Yet beneath this surface lay the quiet orchestration of thought, mood, and interior life, a phenomenon previously unacknowledged, now visible to Eleanor's keen attention. She realized the significance. Acknowledgement of the tonic's influence was the first step toward understanding, awareness, and perhaps eventual agency. Recognition, even in a small circle of friends, offered the possibility of reclaiming interior life, questioning habits, and resisting unconscious dependence. As the afternoon waned, Eleanor observed subtle interactions among her friends, shared glances, mirroring gestures, and synchronized moments of restlessness or calm. Each observation reinforced the truth she had slowly pieced together over months. The tonic, socially sanctioned and chemically active, had quietly shaped thought, mood, and behavior. Its influence extended beyond households, creating patterns of mirrored symptoms, synchronized rhythms, and shared experiences previously unrecognized. In her journal, she wrote, The moment the truth begins unfolding is quiet, almost imperceptible. It arrives in shared recognition, mirrored experiences, and subtle acknowledgement. The tonic is no longer a remedy alone, it is a conductor, orchestrating not merely the lives of individuals, but the rhythms of an entire community. Even in the quiet of her own parlor, Eleanor felt the unfolding truth reverberate. She reflected on her private hours, her observations of friends and neighbors, and the oscillating rhythms of energy, attention, and restlessness. The tonic's influence, once invisible, now appeared undeniable, extending through networks of habit, social expectation, and chemical orchestration. The truth, though unfolding slowly, illuminated months of observation and reflection. Women's lives were shaped, their quiet hours guided, and their autonomy subtly constrained by a force previously considered innocuous. Recognition, Eleanor understood, was both revelation and responsibility, the first step in understanding the delicate balance of influence, dependence, and social expectation that had quietly governed life in Heroic.
The slow withdrawal of a popular drug. Spring's fragile warmth carried over Heroic like a whisper of change. Eleanor Harding noticed a subtle tension threading through the town, a quiet awareness rippling beneath the surface. Whispers reached her ears of a new recommendation circulating among physicians. The popular tonic, once so widely accepted and embraced, was now being reconsidered, its administration advisedly reduced. The amber liquid that had orchestrated moods, rhythms, and quiet hours was, for the first time, facing a slow withdrawal from daily life, a development as delicate as it was profound. Eleanor had anticipated this moment. Months of observation, meticulous notes, and careful reflection had revealed the tonic's pervasive influence over women's minds, behavior, and social patterns. Its removal, however gradual, threatened to unravel the subtle networks of dependence that had quietly governed households and drawing rooms alike. The withdrawal was not abrupt. It was a delicate, measured tapering, advised by physicians who feared both overdependence and social unrest. Housewives received the recommendation in hushed, carefully worded instructions. Doses would be reduced slightly each week, with attention paid to signs of restlessness, agitation, and anxiety. The amber liquid, once central to daily routines, would diminish in presence, leaving women to navigate familiar rhythms without the guiding influence they had grown accustomed to. Eleanor observed the first signs of this slow withdrawal in Lydia Farnsworth. Lydia's morning routine had been punctuated by the precise intake of the tonic, each dose dictating energy, focus, and calm. Now the schedule shifted, the amber liquid administered in smaller quantities, her energy and restlessness oscillating in ways increasingly unpredictable. She paused, embroidery forgotten, hands hovering over needle and thread. "I feel unbalanced," Lydia whispered to Eleanor one morning. "My mind wanders in ways it did not before. I do not recognize the rhythm of my own hours." Eleanor recorded the words meticulously. This was the first overt acknowledgement of the tonic's influence, its gradual removal revealing dependence previously invisible even to the women themselves. Across Heroic, other households experienced similar subtle dislocations. Mrs. Alcott, accustomed to the regimented calm produced by daily consumption, now felt restlessness in moments when previously she had been serene. Miss Clare, too, found herself pacing more frequently, her attention flitting unpredictably between tasks once approached with careful precision. The very rhythms that had been structured by the tonic now resisted, revealing a landscape of dependence that was both personal and social. The women, initially unaware of the source of their disquiet, began confiding in one another. Tea tables and sewing circles became spaces of delicate acknowledgement. Bursts of restlessness, unexpected irritability, and lapses in attention were shared with subtle hesitation, each confession carrying a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I cannot help but feel unmoored," Lydia admitted, tracing a delicate pattern on her handkerchief. "The tonic, it guided my hours, my thoughts, and now, even with smaller doses, I am adrift." Miss Clare nodded gravely. "Yes, I feel it as well. The rhythm of my quiet hours is no longer mine to command. Even the smallest reduction changes everything." Eleanor's journal grew heavy with these observations. She recognized that the slow withdrawal was not merely a medical adjustment, it was an unearthing, a revelation of the subtle dependence carefully hidden by routine, social expectation, and chemical influence. The effects of gradual withdrawal were most apparent during the quiet hours, once structured with precision and regulated by tonic consumption. Women found that moments of reflection, embroidery, or reading now carried unexpected restlessness. Energy spiked or faltered unpredictably, attention fractured. The once invisible conductor of interior life was receding, and in its absence, the consequences of prolonged guidance became undeniable. Eleanor observed Lydia during one such hour. She had set herself to read a letter by candlelight, yet her gaze wandered repeatedly, hands trembling slightly. Her breathing was uneven, reflecting both agitation and uncertainty. The tonic's dosage, reduced per the new instructions, had failed to maintain the previous rhythm. The delicate orchestration of thought, attention, and calm was breaking down, revealing dependence that had remained largely invisible until now. Social interactions revealed the collective nature of withdrawal. Friends, accustomed to the shared rhythms orchestrated by the tonic, found their behaviors subtly unsynchronized. Tea gatherings, once harmonious in attention, focus, and repose, now displayed uneven rhythms, bursts of chatter interrupted by silence. Restlessness mirrored inconsistently, attention flitting unpredictably between conversation, embroidery, and observation. Eleanor noted this subtle anxiety this produced. Women, previously unaware of the synchronization enforced by the tonic, began to sense its absence. They could not articulate fully the source of their discomfort, but they felt it keenly. The slow withdrawal had disrupted the quiet network of chemical and social alignment, revealing the extent of influence previously taken for granted. The withdrawal process illuminated dependence in unexpected ways. Women who had believed their composure and focus to be natural discovered that both were, in large measure, guided by chemical influence. The amber liquid, once invisible in its orchestration, now revealed itself through absence, lapses in calm, bursts of restlessness, moments of scattered attention, and a subtle anxiety that threaded through conversation and private reflection alike. Lydia remarked one morning, her hands clasped tightly around a teacup. "I did not realize how much I relied on it. Even in smaller amounts, I feel unsteady. My own hours, my thoughts, they no longer follow my intention alone." Miss Clare, fidgeting with her embroidery thread, responded softly, "Yes, it is as though a gentle conductor has receded, leaving us to navigate a rhythm we once followed without thought. It is both liberation and uncertainty." Eleanor recorded every word, recognizing the broader social and psychological implications. The tonic had created a hidden architecture of influence, now revealed in the subtle chaos of withdrawal. Physicians, aware of both the dependence and the potential social unrest, advised caution. Doses were reduced gradually, attention paid to observable restlessness, agitation, or anxiety. Families were instructed to monitor behaviors, provide reassurance, and maintain routines. Yet the subtle orchestration once provided by the tonic could not be fully replaced. The withdrawal was slow, delicate, and uneven, highlighting the profound effects of long-term consumption. Eleanor observed the care with which these instructions were followed. Mothers administered reduced doses with measured precision, noting changes in restlessness, attention, or energy. Fathers, often oblivious to the underlying chemical orchestration, attributed lapses to fatigue, temperament, or duty. Yet the women themselves, now partially aware of their dependence, began to perceive the subtle network of influence that had governed their lives. In private moments, Eleanor reflected on the broader implications. The tonic's withdrawal revealed not only dependence, but the delicate integration of chemical, social, and psychological influence. Interior life, once subtly guided, was now in flux. Quiet hours, once orchestrated with invisible precision, became spaces of tension and uncertainty. Social gatherings, once harmonious, displayed uneven rhythms. Dependence, previously invisible and unremarkable, became observable, manifesting in restlessness, bursts of attention, and moments of languor. Eleanor's journals documented these patterns with meticulous care, capturing both individual and collective experiences.
The women who had to heal in silence. The first gentle warmth of spring brought little relief to the women of Harrowick. While the crocuses pushed through thawing soil and sunlight began to linger longer in the drawing rooms, a quieter, more insidious process unfolded behind closed doors. The amber tonic, once so faithfully consumed, had been reduced or removed, leaving in its place restlessness, oscillating moods, and the lingering echo of chemical dependence. And yet, society's expectation of decorum demanded that this turmoil remain invisible. Women had to heal in silence. Eleanor Harding observed the phenomenon with a mixture of empathy and careful documentation. The quiet suffering, often dismissed as fatigue, temperament, or nerves, was in fact the invisible labor of adjustment, the slow process of reclaiming autonomy from the subtle orchestration of the tonic. Every woman who once relied on the amber liquid now faced the delicate challenge of restoring equilibrium, alone and under the watchful eye of social expectation. Lydia Farnsworth had grown accustomed to masking her discomfort. Each morning she would arise, perform the household rituals, and greet visitors with composure that belied her interior restlessness. Her energy, once guided by the tonic, now rose and fell unpredictably. She moved with careful deliberation, aware that any outward sign of agitation or distraction would be observed and silently judged by family or friends. "Do not let them see it," Lydia whispered to Eleanor one afternoon as they walked together in the garden. "The house, the neighbors, they cannot know. We must appear composed, as if nothing has changed." Eleanor understood the gravity of her words. Healing could not be public, could not be acknowledged openly. The women of Harrowick were bound by social expectation to present calm, decorum, and propriety, even as their interior lives adjusted to the absence of the tonic. In the drawing rooms and parlors of Harrowick, the process of silent recovery unfolded subtly. Miss Clare, seated by a window, would spend hours in private contemplation, stitching slowly and deliberately, yet her hands trembled at intervals. She moved quietly, avoided drawing attention, and kept conversations measured, careful not to reveal the oscillations of her energy and attention. Eleanor observed the careful choreography of concealment. The women had become adept at masking the lingering effects of chemical dependence, navigating a delicate balance between visible composure and interior struggle. Laughter, conversation, and social interaction were practiced, rehearsed, and meticulously moderated. Every gesture, every word was calibrated to meet societal expectation while maintaining a fragile equilibrium. Even the simplest domestic tasks became arenas of careful attention. Folding laundry, preparing meals, or tending to children required deliberate pacing, as bursts of energy and moments of languor threatened to betray the ongoing process of adjustment. Women who had once relied on the tonic to maintain calm and attention now depended on discipline, self-awareness, and mental fortitude to navigate each hour without revealing the inner turbulence. Eleanor noted that the quiet recovery demanded extraordinary resilience. Each woman was simultaneously healer, observer, and participant, monitoring her own reactions while maintaining the appearance of serene propriety. The process was invisible to the outside world, yet profound in its psychological and emotional intensity. Friendships offered subtle support, though these too were constrained by expectation. Conversations at tea tables or sewing circles often touched only lightly on shared restlessness or attention lapses. Women confided in careful, measured tones, aware that too much openness could attract scrutiny or judgment. Yet these exchanges were vital. Acknowledgement of shared struggle, even in quiet and coded language, provided solace and reassurance that the process of healing was not faced entirely alone. Miss Clare confided softly to Eleanor one afternoon, "It is comforting, in a way, to know I am not alone, but we cannot speak freely. The world expects composure. We must appear unaffected, even as we rebuild ourselves from within." Eleanor recorded the observation carefully, recognizing it as a critical element of this chapter of women's lives. Silent healing, bound by social expectation, communal in experience, but solitary in practice. The slow withdrawal of the tonic had revealed not only dependence, but resilience. Women learned to navigate their own rhythms without chemical guidance, to recognize the oscillations of energy and mood, and to develop strategies for maintaining composure. Private reflection, journaling, and deliberate routines became essential tools, forming a framework for interior stability in the absence of the amber liquid. Lydia, for instance, found solace in the morning light, in structured household routines, and in the quiet companionship of Eleanor. By pacing her work, alternating between activity and rest, and monitoring her thoughts carefully, she regained a measure of equilibrium. Yet every success was shadowed by the awareness that society demanded invisibility. Healing was not celebrated. It was a quiet, disciplined labor of will. Even families remained largely unaware of the full scope of this interior adjustment. Husbands, fathers, and brothers observed composure, noting minor lapses as fatigue or temperament, yet rarely perceived the depth of chemical and psychological realignment occurring behind closed doors.
Mrs. Alcott managing her household demonstrated extraordinary fortitude. She paced the rooms with a measured gait, tending to domestic duties while negotiating unpredictable swings of attention. Her interior struggle was invisible, yet the discipline required to maintain social expectation was evident only to herself and a trusted few, such as Eleanor. Healing in silence also carried a psychological weight. Women confronted not only the physical and mental effects of tonic withdrawal, but the lingering sense of loss, of a familiar rhythm, a chemical guide, and the subtle orchestration of thought and mood. Recovery demanded mindfulness, reflection, and emotional self-regulation. Journals became confidants, detailing oscillations of energy, moments of agitation, and strategies for maintaining composure. Eleanor's own entries mirrored these practices. She chronicled her methods of pacing, attention management, and emotional regulation. The active writing became an exercise in self-observation, providing clarity and structure to an interior life navigating the absence of chemical orchestration. As spring deepened, Eleanor observed incremental recovery. Women's rhythms slowly adjusted, bursts of restlessness lessened, and attention stabilized. Yet the labor remained quiet, disciplined, and largely invisible to the broader community. Recovery, though underway, was not celebrated. It was performed with discretion, diligence, and perseverance. The amber tonic's absence revealed both vulnerability and resilience. Women had learned to navigate interior life independently, to manage attention, energy, and emotion, and to maintain social propriety under observation. Healing in silence had become both a necessity and a testament to quiet fortitude.
Looking back at a drug that shaped an entire generation. As the last blossoms of spring began to fade, Eleanor Harding found herself in quiet reflection. The streets of Harrowick had softened under the gentle sun, the once harsh chill of winter replaced by warmth and light. Yet the memories of the past months remained vivid in her mind. She walked slowly through the familiar avenues, observing children playing in gardens, women bustling about in domestic chores, and the gentle rhythm of a town settling into a new season. It was here, amidst the ordinary cadence of life, that Eleanor truly understood the enduring legacy of the tonic, the amber liquid that had, for decades, quietly shaped the lives of women, their households, and their interior worlds. The tonic, once celebrated as a remedy, a proper elixir for nerves, restlessness, and female fatigue, had been consumed without question by generations of women. Its administration, sanctioned by physicians, fathers, and social custom, orchestrated moods, energy, and attention with an invisible hand. For years, the subtle chemical influence went unnoticed, even by those most intimately affected. Husbands blamed temperament, fatigue, or circumstance. Society attributed restlessness or languor to moral or emotional weakness. Few questioned the medicine itself. Eleanor paused outside the Farnsworth house, her gaze lingering on the familiar facade. She recalled Lydia, once dependent upon the tonic, her interior life quietly guided by chemical orchestration. She remembered the afternoons spent observing mirrored restlessness in drawing rooms, bursts of energy followed by languor, and the delicate synchrony among friends. The slow withdrawal of the tonic had revealed dependence that had previously been invisible. Yet these moments of revelation had also illuminated the extraordinary resilience of women navigating interior upheaval in silence. Through her journals, Eleanor traced the trajectory of a generation, women whose lives were intertwined with a medicine that promised calm yet delivered subtle control,
who learned to maintain composure under societal scrutiny, who shared mirrored symptoms and quietly supported one another without explicit acknowledgement. These were women who had endured, adapted, and rebuilt, often alone, within the strict confines of propriety and expectation. The chemical influence had been pervasive, shaping thought, mood, and social interaction in ways both subtle and profound. It dictated rhythms of the day, orchestrated attention, and guided the quiet hours. In households across Harrowwick, women's interior lives had been sculpted by the tonic, often without their conscious awareness. Husbands observed change, yet misattributed it. Physicians recommended administration, yet ignored long-term consequences. Society embraced propriety over introspection. The amber liquid was invisible in its power, yet its legacy was written across the lives it touched. Eleanor's reflections extended to the broader social fabric. The tonic had fostered networks of mirrored behavior among friends, synchronized routines across households, and unspoken rituals of mutual observation and support. Women had moved in tandem with each other's energies and moods, their lives subtly harmonized by chemical influence. The effects, while often imperceptible to outsiders, were profoundly shaping, creating a shared rhythm of experience that defined the generation. With the gradual withdrawal of the tonic, women confronted their dependence quietly, navigating oscillations of energy, attention, and emotion in silence. Healing, as Eleanor had observed, was disciplined, private, and largely invisible to society. Tea tables and sewing circles became arenas of subtle acknowledgement, where shared experience was discussed in hushed tones, gestures, and coded language. Interior lives, once guided by chemical orchestration, were rebuilt through mindfulness, routine, and quiet resilience. Lydia, Miss Clare, and Mrs. Alcott exemplified this labor of restoration. They paced their days, calibrated their energy, and managed attention with deliberate effort. Each smile, measured conversation, and carefully timed gesture was a testament to endurance, discipline, and the reclamation of autonomy. The work was unrecognized by the world, yet profound in its significance. Eleanor recognized the irony. The very same society that demanded composure and propriety had, for decades, fostered dependence upon a medicine designed to produce precisely that appearance. The tonic had been both a tool and a constraint, shaping interior life while remaining unexamined, normalized, and invisible. The women who endured its influence and navigated withdrawal were not simply patients, they were architects of their own resilience, crafting calm, dignity, and equilibrium under the subtle weight of chemical guidance. This reflection prompted Eleanor to consider the broader cultural and historical implications. Across England and beyond, countless households had experienced similar patterns. The tonic had silently dictated rhythms, harmonized social interaction, and defined a lived experience of a generation. Its withdrawal, though slow and measured, illuminated the depth of influence, the resilience of women, and the quiet endurance required to reclaim interior autonomy. The amber liquid's legacy was multifaceted. It was simultaneously a remedy, a constraint, a social tool, and a chemical guide. It shaped relationships, routines, and social networks, orchestrating energy, attention, and emotional state across generations. Husbands had been unaware, physicians complicit in their omission of long-term consequences, and society blind to the subtle orchestration of behavior. Yet Eleanor, through careful observation, reflection, and documentation, recognized the totality of its impact. She walked through the town, observing women in the quiet labor of domestic life, preparing meals, tending children, managing households with an elegance and composure honed through experience, habit, and disciplined recovery. The marks of the tonic remained, invisible yet profound, in posture, in attention, and in the quiet synchronization of social interaction. These were the traces of influence, the echoes of a chemical architecture that had defined a generation. In her journals, Eleanor recorded the final reflections of her study. She chronicled the trajectory from unquestioned administration to gradual withdrawal, the mirrored behaviors observed among friends, the misattributions of husbands and family members, and the silent resilience that marked the recovery of interior life. She noted the social and cultural structures that had reinforced both dependence and discretion, highlighting the interplay between chemical influence and societal expectation. Her entries reflected a nuanced understanding. The tonic had been neither wholly villain nor benign. It had shaped thought, behavior, and social life in ways subtle, pervasive, and profound. Its influence was visible only through careful observation, reflection, and acknowledgement, a truth that Eleanor had painstakingly uncovered and recorded. The women of Harrowwick, in their recovery, demonstrated extraordinary fortitude. They rebuilt interior lives previously guided by chemical orchestration, navigated social expectation with discretion, and supported one another in shared yet silent acknowledgement of experience. This labor of quiet resilience was the legacy of the tonic, revealing both the power of chemical influence and the strength of the human spirit when navigating its withdrawal. Eleanor observed, too, the lessons for future generations. Awareness of chemical influence, attention to dependence, and the cultivation of interior autonomy were essential for preserving dignity and resilience. Knowledge, reflection, and observation became tools for understanding and navigating the delicate balance between societal expectation, chemical influence, and personal agency. Looking back, Eleanor understood the tonic had shaped an entire generation, not merely in terms of mood or behavior, but in the subtle orchestration of daily life, social networks, and interior experience. Women's hours, actions, and attention had been guided, their autonomy quietly constrained, yet their resilience had allowed for adaptation, healing, and reclamation. The amber liquid's legacy was thus inseparable from both dependence and endurance, a silent architect of a generation's interior life. She reflected on the paradox. The tonic's power had been invisible, yet its consequences were enduring. Women had learned to navigate life with chemical guidance and without it, to conceal struggle,